Good morning, everybody. Well, I'll just fall with the door into the house and get started. Okay, the main focus of my research at the university has been for about 20 years the history of collecting at the university. The university has been collecting things as early as 1922. I think in 1922 they got their first painting, and since there, today the collection is about 25,000 art objects. And originally when the university started, of course, if you know the South African history, the university's collection interest was white South African history. So this included the collection of Dutch historical objects, Afrikaner historical objects. But this was actually a preamble, because at that stage, 1922, the university was still an English university. So it's only in the 30s that the university became an Afrikaans university, but the collecting was sort of a preamble into moving the university from being an English university to making it an Afrikaans university. And a lot of the academics was part of this process, and that's one of the reasons that they collected these things. So when it came to collecting documents and books and, well, pretty much all the type of things universities collect, they mostly went for known Afrikaner collections. It doesn't say that was the only thing they collected. I mean, at that stage in 1934, the university, for example, started to collect black historical objects as well. But the problem comes in that with the apartheid idea starting to entrench itself into the university, these were seen as two very different collections. You had on the one side a collection of art and cultural objects and things displayed in something called the Cultural Historical Museum in the Old Arts Building. So, and on the other hand, you had the black historical objects called the Ethnographical Collection, displayed in 3 huts behind the library. So that was the sort of difference between the two at that stage. Now, when it gets to this political difference, over the years, collections came and went. And in 1990, when changes in South Africa started to happen quite rapidly, a lot of these collections sort of was caught in the time. So some of them got discarded, some of them got redonated to other institutions, and some of them got stored, some of them went missing. It's the turmoil of the time sort of had their influence on these collections. Some of them today, there's only a paper trail left telling you about what the collection was. Some of them there's a name left that nobody knows. But in the end, the collections all had a decision were taken about each of these collections, and I interrogated the decision being made by the university, and I'm going to name 1 or 2 examples. There's a collection called the Helgard Miller collection, or it was called that. Helgard Miller was a minister of foreign affairs in the apartheid's government, and he was also responsible for something called the total onslaught. It was the total breakdown of the ANC, the political environment of the day. So he's a very controversial figure. Now, interestingly enough, the university's decision in 1992 was to disband the collection. Now, excuse me, I still don't exactly understand what that means, because they didn't do anything with the collection, they just disbanded it. So the collection still exists, it doesn't have a new name, it's there, but it is disbanded. So it's not called the Helgaard Mirror Collection anymore. It's an interesting thing, and I'll get back to that later. There's also, for example, the university's art collection. At that stage, there was a professor that was chairperson of the art committee of the university, who said that he felt that the university should only collect white art. That also changed in 1992. The university took in a new way of collecting art. Like I said, I'll get back to those things right now to explain to you what the connection would be. So, you have decisions taken about collections, and at that stage it seems that the university's sort of idea behind this was to disband, donate or destroy. And it's not just the collections that had a political influence at that stage that went through this process. I'll take an example. The Department of Zoology had a collection of hunting trophies, which they took the decision to destroy. The hunting trophies dated out of the 1880s. So, my whole look at this, I realized that a lot of decisions in a time of turmoil gets taken without actually thinking of the continuing practice of what will be the end game. And I'll give you an example of something where it proved that the end game was in the end more important than getting rid of the collection. There's a collection called the Vijay Kumar collection. It was donated in 1937 to the university. It's a Dutch history collection. And at that stage, it was seen as not relevant to South Africa. And the university tried to redonate the collection to the Dutch government. The Dutch government said they don't see any use for the collection, so they don't want it. So it stayed at the university. Now, about 4 years ago, I got an interesting phone call from a guy in the Netherlands saying he's doing research on this Van Gijbrand-Oosterhof's visit to South Africa. Because when he came to South Africa, he had a meeting with people who would later on become very important historical figures in the apartheid's government, including D.F. Malan, J.G. Strydom, and Verwoerd. And he wanted to know why. So he came here, and in the collection he found a manuscript called authorship. It's a very controversial idea in these sort of nationalistic history, saying that the people that built the infrastructure owns the authorship of it. The book has never been published at that stage, but it seems that this Van Gijbrand-Oosterhof brought this manuscript to South Africa. And this manuscript might just be the document where the idea of apartheid came from, where the physical written laws that it came out of this document, a totally unknown thing. Now, if this document has been redonated, this would never have been found. So, in the end, what I say is that before you can actually go and contemplate this whole idea of disband, donate, or destroy, you have to go into and contemplate if enough research has been done on the collection to see how that could be relevant. So, the current strategy that we have at the moment when it gets to collections, because of course I don't know how well most of you follow South African news, but it's a problem worldwide. In South Africa it was Rhodes Must Fall. In the United States you have the problems that they have with the monuments regarding the Civil War. So there's all kinds of movements in the world, And that doesn't pertain just to sculptures and memorials, it also pertains to collections. And in the university's case, for example, it pertains to things like portraits, busts of people that worked at the university. So it comes down to, what do you do with these things when they get removed or relocated? And the university's art committee went on a sort of looking at reinterpretation rather than removal or destruction or redonation. So when it gets, for example, to the historical portrait collection of the university, we got an artist to to reinterpret those portraits without touching the portraits, but to add to the portrait, to add extra artworks to the portraits, reinterpreting the history of them. So you have the portraits as well as these artworks hanging in one location. So it's a reinterpretation of history. So it's of course not an easy process, and the biggest problem with it is you will always get your returns from it. You'll get people commenting on the process of it, and you always have three sides to the same story. So at this stage, the university is still making sense sometimes of what to do with certain collections, but the key for the university is research. And most of our collections has not been researched enough to actually make a call of what the future should hold. So we are currently embarking on a research. We have to take it to a bit more international level. We have a collection called the Van Tilburg collection, which is for years it's been said that the collection was stolen by the Nazis from the Jews. So the university embarked on an entire process of researching the claims and researching the origin of each of the artworks. At this stage, it's still in its infancy. I think of all the artworks, we've had one that we finished the research on, but the university did, as early as in 1980, said that if it is ever proven that any artwork belongs not to the person that donated it, but that it belongs to somebody else, the university will give it back. Which is actually, as far as I can see, a very controversial thing if you look at museums across the world. It's not a stance taken by a lot of institutions with objects. So, like I say, it's still a work in progress, but the university hopes that in 10 or 20 years' time that we'll see the difference we've made when it gets to the collections of the university and how that collection fits into the bigger picture of South Africa. Thank you.
When Isabel approached me and asked me would I come through and say really a few words around heritage and trying to craft the topic that we're looking at, I've termed it a broad approach to heritage, trying to understand our approach in defining heritage. And really, the focus of this paper is to gain a broader perspective on the definitions of heritage, such as tangible, intangible, movable, immovable, natural, and cultural. And of course, I can go on with many more, throw out a few more words as well around different types of heritage. And really, in defining these, trying to gain a better understanding of the limitations of categorizing them so rigorously. So do forgive me if it is a bit of a theoretical paper, but I think it does take us back to basics in terms of our approach in how we approach heritage within the South African environment. In order to develop a long-term meaningful relationship with current and potential future heritage audience, there's a need to appreciate the ways in which people engage with heritage in a much broader sense, and to understand the meanings and relevance that heritage may represent within this context. Whilst heritage, after history, is accepted as a framed interpretation of a past, its precise terms and meanings still remains very much ambiguous. This is well illustrated by the ongoing pursuit in the literature of an appropriate definition in our attempts to define heritage. Hewson in 1987 stated, "Once it is appreciated how many things there are to which the word heritage is attached, the word becomes absurd." Lowenthal in 1991 argued that so widespread and fast-growing is such a concern that heritage defies definition. The above concerns are echoed in the introduction to a book on the construction of heritage by Brett in 1996. He stated, "I shall not be offering a definition of the term, since its use has become extremely various and vague." Edson in 2004 asked as well, "What is heritage?" while simultaneously discussing its significance and accepted need to protect its resources. Early discontent related to the potential shortcomings of traditional dictionary definitions of heritage, such as that which is inherited, one's inherited lot, the conditions of one's birth, anything transmitted from ancestors or past ages, which was judged to be both deceptive and inadequate for a concept taken on a wider relevance and meaning over time. Revised dictionary definitions made some move towards reconciling these limitations, with heritage being defined as value objects and qualities, historic buildings and cultural traditions, things of architectural, historical, or natural value. That's according to the Oxford Dictionary. However, these dictionary definitions, along with others of varying degrees of specificity, fail to convey the highly contextualized and subjective forces that shape the meaning of heritage in modern society. In 2009, Wheeler suggested that too much time is being spent on academic debate and definition of niceties in the tourism literature, with heritage being a prime example. Despite this critique, the widespread and varying use of the term heritage and its elusive definition can be judged to have had an adverse effect upon academic cohesion, as authors continually frame and justify their own terms of reference for their work. Thus, in turn, affects the consistency, transparency, and transferability of new knowledge and understanding gained through heritage research within the various disciplines. If one had to take an interdisciplinary approach to defining heritage, the challenge lies in the fact that heritage is viewed differently from different disciplines and scholarly perspectives. There are two arguments to this. Garrod and Fial in 2001 proposed that lengthy definitional debates are somewhat counterproductive, and that the real danger in concentrating on definitions is that one rarely transcends rhetoric. Conversely, Timothy and Boyd in 2003 maintained that the lack of a clear frame of reference is stifling potential both within academic and practical settings, and that an agreed definition would simplify the concept of heritage and the issues surrounding it. One cause of conflict evident in the literature may lie in the suggestion that heritage is being used to denote two different phenomena. Firstly, heritage is used as a positive reference to heritage as landscape, culture, and so on. And secondly, as a reference to the heritage industry with its underlying negative associations. Furthermore, terms such as cultural tourism, heritage tourism, and arts tourism, to name but a few, are used almost interchangeably with limited consensus regarding whether or not people are talking about the same thing. While the different definitions in defining heritage cause difficulties from an academic perspective, there's a sustained evidence that appropriate definitions are also of interest for professional practice. For example, terms such as natural heritage and cultural heritage need to be more carefully defined as the differing perceptions of heritage can cause confusion within decision-making processes. Furthermore, cross-cultural and national differences in the way heritage, and in particular natural heritage, is viewed intensifies this disparity from a management perspective. In a review of the scope and definitions of heritage and how the term is adopted and utilized by international organizations such as UNESCO and ICOMOS, and charters such as the Venice Charter of 1964 and the World Heritage Convention of 1972, one can conclude that whilst the general scope of heritage is making some progress towards achieving wide agreement, there's no uniformity as to the finer terminology of heritage, which remains neither streamlined nor standardized between countries. Throughout the past few decades, the pursuit of a definition has been hindered by the continual reinterpretation of various heritage-related concepts, such as historic monuments, intangible heritage, and cultural property, and each ensuing organization or charter takes a slightly different stance from its predecessor. This suggests that the lack of an accepted framework of heritage has direct implications for the practical management of its resources and related decision-making processes. Questions of heritage are, therefore, not as straightforward as they might first appear. Perhaps the first and best place to begin addressing these topics is by acknowledging that in a country like South Africa, there's not one heritage or an easily delineated set of distinct identities. The cultures, languages, and heritage of South Africa are multiple, diverse, and dynamic. Intersectional issues of gender, ethnicity, and race further complicate the matter of identity and make it highly inadvisable to categorize the different people contained within our borders. This is especially true in the wake of the apartheid policies which attempted to divide and conquer the majority of the country's population. South Africa is heir to a legacy of different livelihoods, such as famously the Khoisan and the San, as well as the Bantu immigration, slavery, colonization, settler economies, and liberation movements. These histories have all had a drastic effect on the makeup of South Africa's population, and in many cases, our identity as South Africans. Yet somehow, through the interchange of cultures and sharing of cultural influences in the age of globalization, there definitely remains a tapestry of phenomena which can identifiably and unambiguously be termed South African. The National Heritage Council of South Africa offers us following in a starting point in defining the concept of heritage. Heritage is what is preserved from the past as a living collective memory of a people, not only to inform the present about the past, but also to equip successive generations to fashion the future. It is what creates a sense of identity and assures rootedness and continuity, so that what is brought out by dynamism of culture is not hanged for its own sake, but is a result of people's conscious choice to create a better life. In its preamble, the National Heritage Resources Act states that our heritage is unique and precious and cannot be renewed. It helps us to define our cultural identity and therefore lies at the heart of our spiritual well-being and has the power to build our nation. It has the potential to affirm our diverse cultures and in so doing shape our national character. It has a healing quality too, states the Act. It celebrates our achievements and contributes to redressing past iniquities. It also educates by deepening our understanding of society and encourages us to empathize with the experience of others. It facilitates healing and material and symbolic restitution and it promotes new and previously neglected research into our rich oral traditions and customs. A recent dictionary definition defines heritage as anything that has been transmitted from the past or handed down by tradition, or evidence of the past, considered collectively as an inheritance of present-day society, or a way of life practiced in the past. These definitions indicate that anything we can discover or know about the past may be considered as our heritage. But heritage is not simply history. It is rather what we choose to know, what we choose to keep, and what we choose to value from the past. Heritage is that part of our history which defines us and which we cherish. An alternative would be to define heritage as anything which we inherit and which we recognize as rightfully or appropriately belonging to us, and therefore value for that reason, if no other. People often speak of personal heritage, those things from the past that are distinctly one's own. But here I'm referring to collective heritage, those things from the past that belong to groups of people with whom we identify or relate to in some way. Collective heritage is important for two reasons. First, a shared heritage provides us with a common past, and this gives us a sense of identity and belonging. Secondly, a shared heritage is like a rich mine from which we may select and emphasize the good that we choose to cherish and to celebrate with others. These two aspects of collective heritage are closely related because both tie us to other people, often forging amongst us the strongest of bonds. The main difference is that the first, knowledge of our common past, plays a significant role in understanding ourselves and thus shaping our destiny. This aspect of heritage helps us to see what we are and why we are what we are. It also explains our place in the world. The second aspect of heritage, the ability to choose and cherish what we value in our history, enables us to take pride and satisfaction in who we are. It also points to our possible futures, what we want to be, and where we want to go. In essence, there are really only two basic types of heritage: natural heritage and human heritage. There is one type of natural heritage, all things bestowed by nature, such as landscapes, wildlife, botanical communities, etc., etc. Our natural heritage can be a great unifier because it belongs to all of us. Human heritage is much more complex. There are many levels of human heritage. For example, there's personal, family, community heritage, and there's ethnic, national, and world heritage. A good general or encompassing term for human heritage would be cultural heritage, defined as all those special or defining attributes we share with those for whom we feel a unique affinity. This would include, for example, not only the personal bonds we have established with family, friends, and members of our communities and various community organizations, but also associations we feel with our respective ethnic, religious, racial, linguistic, educational, social, and economic groups. We all belong to different ethnic and racial groups, speak different languages, have different religious beliefs, etc., etc. Thus, every individual is an amalgam of different cultural threads, and this composite culture may be quite different to all that of a person's closest friend. Unfortunately, cultural heritage can and very often does divide us. And if we are not sufficiently sensitive to and tolerant of the cultural beliefs and values of others, these beliefs and values become divisive. But if looked at from a broader perspective, cultural diversity is extremely enriching. South Africa has an extraordinarily rich assortment of cultural heritages, and this is a part of what makes South Africa so special. And all these cultural heritages taken together, along with our rich natural heritage, comprise another level of heritage, this country's national heritage, which is indeed something all South Africans should be justly proud of. Within cultural heritage, we have indigenous knowledge. This is local, mostly traditional knowledge, covering medicine, agriculture, religion, rituals, and many other spheres of daily life. Indigenous knowledge has the ability to cross-pollinate and to break the boundaries between our definitions of cultural and natural heritage, our understanding of tangible and intangible heritage. Indigenous knowledge historically played and continues to play a major role in many African countries. It is also usually transmitted orally from one generation to the next, and is therefore, in a world that is rapidly shrinking due to globalization and merging of cultures, is in danger of becoming forgotten. Besides defining what indigenous knowledge is, thanks to the advent of technology, there needs to be a greater emphasis on the exploration, research, and recording of indigenous knowledge and the proved access to it. There are a number of challenges in safeguarding intangible heritage. Over time, many people just stop singing old songs, making old-fashioned things, or learning their grandmother's stories of cooking methods. In some cases, however, people want to keep the intangible cultural heritage alive, even though its viability threatened. Intangible cultural heritage is a living practice, so it is easily affected by factors such as migration of people and communities, social change or conflict, and by repression of or contempt for specific groups' cultural practice in society. The denigration of African culture was, for example, very common in the colonial and apartheid era in South Africa. Keeping intangible and cultural heritage alive in communities possesses many challenges. The first main challenge is to develop ways of helping us to safeguard intangible cultural heritage that maintains its living vibrancy. The second main challenge is to develop legal and ethical frameworks in which NGOs, researchers, or governments can help communities to safeguard the intangible cultural heritage without taking ownership of it away from the people to whom it belongs. We must also think about what museums of the future will be. Will they be very different because they will be reshaped by new technologies? That means we should, for example, not simply be collecting artifacts, but we should be videoing what is going on around us, or documenting, if you want a more appropriate term. And that means more than just demonstrating how things are done and with what life is like now, the atmosphere, the feeling of the place and the times. Traditionally, museums have been concerned principally with the preservation and displaying of objects, artifacts and photographs to convey what has been interesting or meaningful about the past. But new tools and methods are now available, and technology is advancing at an incredible rate. But those in the position of authority to document and capture this heritage are not keeping abreast with the latest technology and using it to the benefit of preserving, documenting, and recording our heritage. Computer-generated technology has the ability to recreate scenes from the past and impart movement to images so that we can better visualize and thus more accurately imagine long-gone things that we would like to witness. Animated exhibits, for example, could be presented using highly accurate digital recreations in a 3D or even a 4D format to recreate fascinating or highly cherished scenes from our times, from both natural and cultural history. Such exhibits would be far more informative and interesting than static displays, even though they are virtual, so long as they are accurate. A visual artifact or virtual artifact can be as powerful and as useful in communicating the essence of something as an actual one. Capturing our heritage faithfully and fully requires that we explore these new technologies and exploit their promise. The final question that can then be asked: does it then matter how we define our heritage? Spending vast amounts of time and energy and paper trying to define and describe the different types of heritage, instead of breaking the silos, adopting a multidisciplinary approach where we document, showcase, and learn from our heritage. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very big honor to be here, and thank you for being able to present to the organizers. I will be chatting with you briefly today about heritage. And if you listen to the first two speakers, you would, at the end of my presentation, you would think that we got together and we discussed the themes. But before going into my presentation, I think it's important that you know where Bernadine comes from. I'm a police officer with 19 years experience, and while being a police officer, the default setting in your thought processes is based on law and legal principles, with a little asterisk there. Pre-constitution law. Throughout my career as a police officer, some of these laws didn't sit well. Some of the things that were going on didn't sit well, because ethically I was not convinced that what we were doing was right. It's got me into hot water many a times because I kept asking the question, but why? But why? And at the end of the day, now I can see but why. I joined UNISA in 2007, and when the call for transformation and decolonising higher education and curriculum came, I was uncomfortable, but I was excited. And this began a search for literature. I identify with the journeys of Appiah and Hermitz. Appiah wrote, "My thinking on these topics have evolved out of discussions of multiculturalism over the past few years. My position today is I'm transparent in my quest to present my understanding, but to declare that I need to understand more. So I present myself to you as a fledgling philosopher. I'm not trained in philosophy. So I'm metaphorically naked in my vulnerability in terms of inviting collaboration and inviting your inputs and insights." So the overview of my presentation will cover the following: culture and heritage as contested concepts, unpacking the reason for my PhD and looking at what culture and cultural heritage is, discussing a little bit of my research results, and then bringing it all together at the end. Contested concepts. I think Paul mentioned it very, very clearly that culture and heritage, there's not one unifying definition for these terms. In 1965, Gailey already introduced this term when he said that essentially contested concepts are there to facilitate an understanding of the different applications or interpretations of the sorts of abstracts, qualitative and evaluated terms, such as art. Because at the end of the day, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And in South Africa, we sit with the same perspective, we sit with the same situation. We talk about cultural objects, cultural heritage, cultural property, heritage objects, cultural heritage objects, and we talk about patrimony. And in all of this, we sit with questions. There is so much confusion from a South African perspective in terms of what these terms actually mean, because they are individual, they are very personal. But what is not contested is culture as a human right. There are international instruments that declare and proclaim culture is an international human right. And so too, our South African Constitution says that culture is a human right. But this brings us to the legislation. And Gerard spoke about the politics and how politics has an influence on culture and heritage. And in 2009, it was already declared that culture will only be protected to the extent which is defined in the legislation of a country. If you look at our National Heritage Resources Act, it has a cultural nationalism or a retentionism paradigm, which simply means that that which belongs to South Africa, we would want to keep, versus the cosmopolitan attitude of the cultures of the world, sharing cultures of the world internationally. So there is clearly a cultural dissonance, there is a disconnect. And in this you find the paradigm of the interpreter. Is the interpreter a universalist, or is the interpreter a particularist? To unpack this, Etiebo argues that those who support Western ideologies and thinking can be defined as Western universalists. The Western Universalist has a superior Western paradigm which evaluates all other paradigms against this supposedly superior Western paradigm. Be mindful, though, that this individual may be a Western Universalist in terms of geographic placement, that is coming from the West, or this person may be a Western Universalist and hail from Asia, Arabia, or even Africa. Hence, the paradigm one holds in the consciousness informs your position either as a Western Universalist or a particularist. In this instance, the particularist is someone who contends that when it comes to reality, different cultures have different explanation frameworks and that Africans have a philosophy that is essentially different from other philosophies. So where does this leave us? When I started doing my study in my PhD, it was about the manifestation of cultural heritage crime. But when you talk about cultural heritage crime, I had to unpack what cultural heritage means. And who did I go to? I went to the practitioners. So the first group I asked were the museums, the people who worked in museums, in art galleries, because these are the people that have to implement legislation. And I asked them, what do you understand by the term cultural heritage? And in this group there were 31 respondents. Now, if you deconstruct the National Heritage Resources Act, what it says cultural heritage as concept is, it consists of 4 elements. It consists of something tangible, with a relationship or an association to someone or something within a specific context. So those are the 4 elements that comprise the definition of cultural heritage. So this is what the participants responded in saying. Only 10 of the participants' explanation or narrative contained all 4 elements. That's less than 50%. 6 participants were able to articulate 3 elements, 5 participants 2, and 10 participants only 1 element. What was interesting in this, however, was that the issue of intangible came out. Because an object is but an object, but it gets its meaning when the story comes along. Otherwise, it's just an object. My second sample set came from the auctioneers, the traders and dealers, the government departments and the NGOs. From them I asked, what is your understanding of a cultural heritage object? There were 15 respondents with a collective of 257 years experience in this field. Now, somebody with that amount of experience collectively, you can imagine the knowledge is going to be explosive. Unfortunately, it was not so. The National Heritage Act clearly articulates what a cultural heritage object is, and there are 90 different classifications that I counted. It was also interesting, all 15 mentioned tangible, 4 mentioned intangible. So, sufficiently broad is our legislation. But what was the understanding? Collectively, 11 categories out of the 19 were mentioned. Collectively, not individually. Giving a breakdown of what the respondents said, only 1 person was able to cover 7 categories. 2, 6 categories, 1, 5 categories, and so on and so forth. 1 person didn't even make mention of any category. So while the legislation is sufficiently broad, it was cognitively contracted. I was tempted to use the word constipated, but I don't think that's the right word for this forum. So what does that mean? Everything in terms of culture and heritage is packed into legislation. But it's difficult to understand what cultural heritage crime is without first understanding what cultural heritage encapsulates. Gerard would be the first person to tell you, if you go to a police station and you report the theft of a pirneef or a sekoto, the first question they ask you, are you insured? As if I can pop down to Dion Wyatt or art is us and buy a new Pirneef. And that is the mentality that we have to challenge. So various aspects influence interpretation, and interpretation impacts on implementation. So whether we're aware of it or not, there are things that influence how we think. And that is why we need to encourage debate away from the admitted Western type of interpretation. We need to be more inclusive and not exclusive. We need to find common ground. We had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a number of years ago. And the problem I have with that is the terminology. Reconcile means to bring together two groups who were one to begin with. As South Africans, we have never been one to begin with. You need to concile before you can reconcile. And I think that is where culture and heritage can come in. We can use that as a tool to first bring people together before we can move forward. And this brings us to decoloniality. Coloniality, according to Maldonado Torres, is about relations of power that can continue to exist after the formal relationship of colonization is over. Black and white, coloniality influenced and affected us all. How we think, how we act in our default settings. Therefore, this aspect of decoloniality is much deeper. It has to go much deeper, and it's personal to each one of us. There's a need for transparency, a need for naked vulnerability. We have to move past the idea of translucency, the appearance of transformation. Kele put it so beautifully, because in this quest I was faced with my whiteness. I was labeled and brushed with the colonialist brush, and I was made to feel as an outsider in Africa. And then I came upon what this author said. People who don't understand what being an African is think physical appearance automatically makes you an African, which we think is wrong. African identity is not defined by race, gender, religion, geopolitical boundaries, or even ethnicity, but by philosophies and ideologies rich in morals, ethics, and an African culture. In essence, African identity is a state of mind. African identity for me is being able to call Africa home, close quote. I've attended several European conferences, and when people hear I'm from South Africa, their default question is, but you're white. So internationally, there's also a perspective of you cannot be white and an African as well, as if the two are mutually exclusive. Mugo then wrote, I am thus an Afropolitan, a citizen of Africa. And this is where I proudly identify myself as an Afropolitan. But to achieve a true Afropolitan state, inclusivity must be part of the narrative. When we talk about culture and heritage, we must move past the silos and we must look at the collective. Paul spoke about something that was very, very interesting. He said that we have to have a heritage which is multiple, diverse, and dynamic. And I think this explains it. Pre-94, we didn't have words like load shedding, ish, toi toi, kwela, shongololo, cheesekop, apartheid, gatvol, vetkoek, ag, bakkie. These are words so South African that it gives me goosebumps, because annually we are adding to the dictionary. We are a dynamic people. And I think there is more that brings us together than that which separates us. But then you sit with this reality that when you shoot a zebra in the black stripe, the white stripe dies too. What affects one part of our society affects all parts. We have to be a collective. We have to stand together. And if I'm being politically incorrect, UP, I apologize. But I think there are more of us that want to be one nation than those of us who want to be divided. It's time that the normal people who make up this country stand together and say, but we are one. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. And I think we are living in one of the most exciting times because we get to write the narrative if we are willing to be brave and stand up. So what will your narrative say? Ngiyabonga, Kialeboga, Danki, Siyabonga, Nkomu, Nkosi. Thank you.
Thank you, the organizers, for bringing me here. It's always a privilege to be in the midst of other scholars and exchanging ideas, and of course, listening to other perspectives, because as Catherine said, I live up in the north, and most people go to the University of Botswana in Gaborone and say, but where is she? So it's a bit of Siberia of Botswana. So I don't see people much. I'm grateful for that. I just want to say that the paper that I'm presenting is largely, am I not? I thought I shouted. It's largely international policy perspective, but focusing on the African story. Because often at times we look at, this is not working? Okay. Most of the times we look at the story within our countries, particularly with participation, but this paper, when I was looking at it, it's actually emanated from my interaction with the director of World Heritage, Roshla, when we were in some of the meetings, that we need to re-look at the World Heritage and its relationship with African heritage conservation. So the inspirations, as you can see, are numerous. I'm going to try and talk about these dichotomies that at times we ignore, not because we want to, maybe obliviously ignore, and we move along, of course, with our little case studies in our countries and forget that we are doing these things because of international policy that has a bearing on the local. And I will try and focus mainly on the World Heritage Model. Not that it's the only one. I just thought for this presentation I'll give that as an example. To share also the ideologies of conservation at an international level, but also the practice and where these things either clash or complement each other. And the implications of that on sustainable conservation of heritage, which is something that I'm passionate about. As Professor Harris said, I did my PhD. It was one of the first PhDs that looked at African archaeological heritage conservation and sustainable development in Africa. And these are the policies that we have as archaeologists in particular. I'm very happy that I'm in both. I'm going to speak very fast because I have 20 minutes and I'm not used to speaking 20 minutes. So I'm going to be speaking very fast, but of course clearly. I was going to say that as archaeologists, we know that most of the heritage started with archaeology, and we were like, we are archaeologists in the dig, why should I worry about policy? But the world is telling us that we cannot do that anymore. So the dichotomies that maybe will be coming out, even though not precisely or specifically pointed out are the regional and international. I hope that after listening to me, you will see this and maybe see where I assess them as a risk for culture management. If they are not well taken care of, the natural and the cultural, I'll show that through the Okavango Delta where I work, the tangible and intangible. I think most of the speakers this morning have touched on that, as well as the political and the socio-cultural, that I'll be talking about World Heritage as a political agreement versus African heritage practice as a socio-cultural event or process. The economic and the symbolic, we know very well that a lot of our heritage now is being looked at from the perspective of tourism, which I am employed for. I forgot to say that. I have been employed for cultural heritage tourism at the University of Botswana, the research on that, but I have also taken on board to teach them that heritage is beyond the economic perspective. So the reason why we are also establishing some programs is to show that heritage for heritage's sake. And this is an African thing. We have mainly looked at heritage from the economic perspective. So I'm going to look at operational tenets of World Heritage concepts. Most of us, I think, I'll take you as an expert on this, we already know. And as I pointed out, there are political agreements, and you can imagine if you are trying to make a political agreement about somebody else everyday bread and butter or identity or an existence, the aggregation is too huge, and there are bound to be risks. And because of that, there also a certain level at the UN level where we are talking about World Heritage, which is ruling conservation management in the world, is that it has come about as a certain cultural perception. It wasn't necessarily Africans and African heritage sitting there and saying, oh, this is how we do things, and maybe let's aggregate it this way. As I point out, it's mainly inspired by, as the literature, most of the literature tell us, it was mainly inspired by the World War happenings. What happened at the World War? A lot of monuments were actually destroyed, and the savings of heritage that inspired the 1972 Convention on World Heritage, as we know it today, as we are crazy about World Heritage sites today, was actually coming from that tangible perspective of visibility. Take that back to Africa, where heritage, of course the monuments are part of it, but most of African heritage is situated in the intangible that became recognized in 2003. That was how many years, I don't know, mathematicians, if my daughter was here, 72, 82, 92, 2002, 30 years of lack. But we have been applying this in Africa, this World War II inspired, and mind you, World War II didn't happen in Africa, but we have been using this inspiration to manage what we call heritage in Africa, and this is where I'm coming from. So I will be focusing mainly on this 1972 convention, not that there are no others, but for the purposes of this presentation, just to drive this point home for discussion. And we all know the 1972 convention is based on the OUVs, the popular, outstanding, universal value. Let me know when there are 10 minutes left. And the criterion can be found in the UNESCO website, and it runs from 1 to 10. So these are some of the things that in the paper will come out very clearly when I write the paper. But for presentation purposes, these OUVs also have been selected looking at aggregated, international, European American inspired concept to be used in African conservation. So the characteristics of international conventions as frameworks of African identity, I was telling my colleagues that it's mainly this chapter in my book that I authored on African heritage conservation. I've already forgotten the title. It's chapter 2 of this book. You can get it from everywhere you are. It's published by Springer, both as an ebook and a paper book. But basically that how sustainable it is using these international conventions, which I've tried to summarize the characteristics as frameworks of African cultural identity as well as African cultural heritage management. Cultural in particular, why am I focusing on the cultural? Of course, a lot of work and a lot of attention, if you are from Botswana, is on the natural. So by virtue of me working in the Okavango Delta, I have taken it upon myself to focus on the cultural, because everyone is focused on the natural. Botswana has one of the most impressive policies on natural conservation, but we lack a lot when we come to the cultural aspect. So my research at the Okavango Delta focuses largely on overlaying cultural perspectives within the protected areas that are viewed as natural wilderness and wildlife, and to show governments and also to show communities that they can acknowledge the identities without necessarily being conflicted, because a lot of governments are skeptical of having communities identify in these now isolated spaces of wilderness and wildlife, because they are afraid of claims to claims to relocate back. If you look at it, like somebody was mentioning the San, we have the Bushmen as well in Botswana, and we also have other communities, as I'll show, that are laying claim now to this delta, that we've always been there, we made way for government, but the world is changing, we want the benefits. So there are these issues that are coming up that are blocking cultural heritage acknowledgement. So you will find that most, when we look at the dichotomies at the international level, I want to point out that most of the sites on the World Heritage List are cultural. But the World Heritage Model will tell you there's a buffer zone and a core zone. When you list your site, you have to have those two zones, all of them delineated. And that means what? If the core zone should be free of people, it happened when we listed Zodilo World Heritage Site. And the Okavango Delta, already the government had done the job, the people relocated. Of course, the environment is also hostile. So the World Heritage, the 1,000 World Heritage listing found that to be the case. But guess what? The lucrative tourism operation is not isolated from the landscape. So these are some of the dichotomies that I was saying. If a World Heritage Model says you have to move people from the core zone, but the economics cannot be moved, are we really not a culture in crisis? Because the landscapes are platforms within which cultural heritage is actually expressed and deposited. So this has created a lot of conflict. If you read the literature on the Okavango Delta tourism in particular, it's mainly about this and it's getting heated. I think most of you who read international news have actually heard about how Richard Branson wanted to invest in the Okavango Delta, and the communities in the surrounding village where I work actually stopped it. They stopped the transfer of land, and it got really bad. So it's because of time I can't go into this, but I just wanted to highlight the conflicts that are emanating in passing. And if you look at the statistics in the World Heritage properties, you find that most of the sites that are there, Africa has the lowest number, Africa and the Arab states. It's all there in the UNESCO World Heritage statistics. They have few sites. But when you get to sites in danger, this region, especially Africa with a few sites, has the highest number of sites in danger. And therein lies my hypothesis that the ideology may be not compatible with the practice. How do you get a region? Mind you, the Arab state, these are Arab states, they're not a region, and Africa is a region. So it's not really a comparison. How do you get a region with so many countries and very few sites that are listed? Why are African states not really interested in listing, or why are they not getting through? Even with the establishment of the African World Heritage Fund, which is based in South Africa, and it is meant to fund the listing processes for Africa and, of course, encourage it, Africa is still lagging behind. Why are they not crazy about this concept that clearly is making a lot of sound in Europe? And the statistics, unfortunately, it's not clear, but when you go to that website, I just wanted to highlight that. If I go to it, then I'll eat my 20 minutes, so I'll avoid that. So you'll find that Europe has the highest number, Europe and the Americas. And mind you, we all know from the UNESCO how many times America pulls out of UNESCO. I'm not going to go there either, but just saying. But they have a lot of sites because the concept is owned, isn't it? Therein lies my hypothesis. Africa region leads in the sites in danger because, in my view, and in some of the discussions that I provide here, it's because the concepts of conservation and land use and maybe access to these protected areas of wilderness and wildlife are actually, what do you call it, they are making it difficult for African heritage practice to take place. So you find this clash where we will end up with what you will call sites in danger because of what might be seen as poaching, what might be seen as destruction of the core zone, whereas in fact we have found Zodilo Hills and the Okavango Delta World Heritage Sites intact and listed them even though those people has always been there. The concept of delineating what is a World Heritage there, in my view and in the discussions that I elaborate in most of my writings, do not match. So the World Heritage concept, in my view, needs reviewing for an international policy that is encompassing to the global perspective. I'm going to give here an example of the Okavango World Heritage Site, which was listed recently, and it was listed as a natural site. But being there, I've been there for 10 years plus, we all know there is lots of aspects that are cultural that could have informed it to be listed as a mixed site. But because of the convenience of the World Heritage listing and the tenets of it, it got away. But nobody even at that international level realized it. And again, these same communities have written to UNESCO, and there's a lot of processes that are going on. And as researchers, the best we can do is to research and provide information. And I just wanted you to, we have this publication that has come out in the Oxford Handbook of Public Heritage. You can read about the Okavango, the suffocated cultural heritage of the Okavango Delta. 5 minutes? Okay, thank you. I'll need to wrap up. But all in all, I'm saying that the way the World Heritage concept is coined is such that it is not allowing for all these other identities. The archaeologies of the Okavango Delta's protected areas are not yet explored, and that is part of the work that I'm doing. I'm still stuck at the histories because of access and all the complications of getting funding for it. Histories and anthropologists. The living heritages, fortunately, there are other scholars who are working on it. And just to give an example of what can we do to make sure that we inform this international perspective, the World Heritage, to become more inclusive. This work, I did a lot of surveying with local communities through the Botswana Defence Force, and these are the sites that I talk about, that the Okavango Delta shouldn't have been listed as a natural site, because we now know for sure that I had 5 ethnic groups who we just took the boat and the GPSs and mapped the identities. They are remembered memory identities, and then we will overlay with archaeological in future. But also just to point out the local communities in protected areas, particularly in South Africa and Botswana, and Namibia, a lot of issues around the Seine. But it's not only the Seine. If you go to Botswana now, there are lots of other communities, particularly for the Okavango Delta, who are saying the Moremi Game Reserve, they are laying claim. They are all the Seine and the Bantus and everyone is in here, and they are challenging their own government. And since we changed the president recently, the new president is in trouble because people can just talk. Now they are talking to him. They were fearful of the last one. So local communities in protected area, it's basically UNESCO's 2003 convention, which again, by virtue of international delineation of heritage, it's absurd that we can have a site listed under the 1972 convention without an overlay of the Intangible Heritage Convention. For Africa, that doesn't make sense. But for World War II destroyed monuments, it does make sense. So these are the discrepancies we are looking at. These are just examples that I'm giving. These are the chiefs that I did work with that inform my research. And my argument is that most of the African sites we should be looking at a World Heritage perspective as mixed. And everywhere where the 1972 convention is applied, it has to be alongside the 203 convention. We cannot have a luxury of having one or the other. I'm done. Okay. So those are the interventions. This is part of the survey that I do in the Okavango Delta with the Botswana Defence Force. But we are also talking to the government to say balanced interpretation of natural heritage sites means acknowledging both the cultural and the natural, not protecting sites only as monuments destroyed in the war, because in Africa, Moremi Game Reserve is not a monument destroyed in the war to be protected as a tangible perspective. So these are just examples, and we can discuss, but I just wanted to acknowledge a lot of institutions that make my work easier.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Davison Chiwara from the Midland State University. Actually, my presentation topic reads Risk Assessment and Community Engagement, the key for sustainable protection of Old Bulawayo Theme Park against disasters. I had to change the topic and realign it with the theme for this session through the request of the conference organizers. The Old Bulawayo Theme Park is situated 27 kilometers outside the present city of Bulawayo, which is the country's second capital city. It was declared a national monument in 1966 by the then Rhodesia Commission for the Preservation of Natural and Historical Monuments and Relics because of its historical significance. It was King Lobengula's first capital, occupied between 1870 and 1881. King Lobengula was the son of King Mzilikazi, who fled from South Africa with the Ndebele people to Zimbabwe during the period of political uprisings known as Mfekane. As a result of its significance to the history of Zimbabwe, this site was turned into a theme park known as Old Bulawayo by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, and it was opened to the public in 2006. Those are the pictures of the theme park. It became a living museum meant to remember and celebrate the culture of the Ndebele people, who are the second biggest ethnic group in Zimbabwe outside the Shona people. It was intended to be an educational and cultural tourism resource that showcases the identity, spirituality, values, taboos, morals, and instill a sense of pride among the Ndebele people. It consisted of 9 beehive houses, 1 wagon shed, the Lobengula's house, a cattle pen, and an interpretive center which showcased the history and life of King Lobengula and his people. However, this living museum was gutted by fire in August 2010, razing everything, including the surrounding palisade, and some artifacts were burnt. I tried to get the actual number of the burnt artifacts from officials at NMMZ, but I couldn't get the figure. However, now plans are underway for the resuscitation of the theme park. In light of this background, the aim of my research was to offer guidelines for the sustainable protection of the Old Bulawayo Theme Park against foreseeable risks, now that there are considerations to resuscitate the theme park. The objectives of my research were as follows: to determine the possible sources of fire risk for the Old Bulawayo Theme Park, as well as to assess the level of community participation in safeguarding the theme park. Here are my findings. The possible sources of the fire disasters that gutted the theme park included gold panning activities, poaching at the nearby Matogo National Park, as well as farming activities by local communal farmers. The possible sources of this fire risk, as I have indicated, include gold panning activities, poaching in the nearby Matopos, as well as farming activities by local farmers. The theme park is located in rural areas where there is communal farming and panning activities. So when communal farmers are clearing their land in preparation for the new farming season, they use fire to clear their land. The poachers, when they are driving animals in a certain direction, they lit fire. They use fire for driving those animals, as well as the goat panners. Whenever they are trying to clear land that they are working on, they use fire. So the possibility of a fire risk there was inevitable. Then in terms of community involvement, I discovered that the community is really involved in the management of the theme park, even though when it was established, it was meant to be a community project whereby the community was supposed to be at the center of activities that should have been taking place at the theme park. But however, their involvement has been limited. And in terms of preparing for the disaster, most of them, they had no knowledge on how to respond to on how to respond to such kind of disasters that affected the theme park. And also, in addition to community involvement, in terms of preparing for the disasters, nothing much was done by the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe to prepare the communities, as well as to prepare the staff working at the theme park to respond to the disasters, in terms of material resources, in terms of staff training, as well as offering some fire guards to prevent fire disasters. There was no such facilities. Hence, when the fire broke out, it raised everything save for the interpretive center that was left intact, but otherwise the rest of the structures that were built there, they were gutted down by the fire. So in terms of my recommendations for this envisaged new theme park that they would like to rebuild, I recommend that the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe need to put the community at the center of the management of the theme park. They also need to enlist representatives from the community for the management of this theme park, and also train them on how to respond to such kind of disasters should they be faced again in the future. NMMZ, that is the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe, should also embark on awareness campaigns aimed at educating the local communities to prevent wildfires and any other risks that may be caused by those activities that I mentioned, that is the farming activities, as well as gold mining activities by the locals. So they need to be educated about the dangers of such activities to the safety of this theme park. As a way of concluding my presentation, Edith Weiss Brown coined the concept of conservation and intergenerational equity. She argued that human beings hold the natural and cultural resources of the planet in trust for all generations of the human species. So she also argued that the human beings hold the natural and cultural resources of the planet in trust for all generations of the human species, and each generation of human beings holds a planetary trust which obliges it to preserve the diversity of the resource base and to pass the planet to future generations in a usable condition. Failure to honor this obligation would deprive future generations of the opportunity to use and enjoy this heritage. Therefore, the National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe and the community have an obligation to ensure that sustainable care and protection against risks is taken on this theme park and pass on this priceless heritage to future generations. Failure to honor this obligation will deprive future generations the opportunity to use and enjoy this heritage. Thank you.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak today. I am a longtime fan, first-time speaker here at the at the Culture in Crisis conferences. But with that being said, I'm a bit sad that I will be giving a bit of a pessimistic talk today, as many of you may have guessed from the title alone. Well, a little less than 2 weeks ago, 13 days ago in fact, the International Panel on Climate Change issued a pretty tragic report that essentially stated, as the Brookings Institute eloquently paraphrased, "We are almost out of time." To put the report in context, because there is a lot of numbers in there, the difference between today's average global temperatures and that of the last ice age was between 4 and 7 degrees. And our current trajectory of adding more than 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere annually has us moving towards 3 degrees by the end of this century. A likewise dire report emerged earlier this year as the International Union for Conservation of Nature, originally launched in 1964, stated that the number of species threatened with extinction has risen to more than 26,000, more than a quarter of all species under assessment. Now, missing from the self-proclaimed comprehensive report issued by the IPCC, however, was, with its 91 authors and editors from some 40 different countries, is of course any mention of the impact of climate change on cultural heritage, either tangible or intangible. However, we know that such dramatic environmental changes will greatly impact our ability to preserve heritage sites around the world. Even if mitigation efforts begin immediately, it is pretty certain that just as species will go extinct, so too will heritage sites be lost. Just as ecosystems will disappear, so too will the traces of cultural histories. Now, it isn't your imagination if you have noticed an uptick in news stories reporting the discovery of very well-preserved artifacts emerging from both melting permafrost and glaciers in northern regions. This year alone, in Norway's Oppland region, archaeologists have recovered more than 2,000 objects simply by surveying the edges of Oppland's retreating glaciers. While the popular press has been dazzling the public with stories of perfectly preserved fossils, mummies, or artifacts, there were some perfectly preserved skis earlier this year, archaeologists have been watching this with much less enthusiasm. The constant freeze-thaw process inherent in these spectacular finds speeds up the decomposition through chemical, bacterial, and physical processes. And indeed, some estimates suggest that there will be no permafrost left, even in the northernmost parts of places like Alaska by the end of this century, rapidly enhancing the deterioration of objects and sites that could shed light on such important questions as the peopling of the Americas through the domestication of the dog. Of course, as global temperatures continue to rise, it is more than permafrost that will continue to melt. Global sea ice is currently melting at a pace that may end up with ice-free summers in the Arctic occurring as often as once in a decade. This much extra water obviously ends up in the ocean and causes dramatic increases in the average global sea levels, threatening communities and heritage sites located on islands and in coastal regions. The warning of this threat probably was never more stark than way back in 2002, as UNESCO celebrated the 30th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention in Venice, and it did so largely underwater due to the exceptionally high aqua alta, and this will of course become much more common, if not a permanent occurrence, as climate change continues. African heritage sites from Saint Louis in Senegal to Pemba Island in Tanzania are at risk of simply disappearing under the waves. On the other end of the spectrum, increased global temperatures mean longer and drier summers, leaving woodland regions around the world susceptible to increasingly destructive wildfires. Earlier this year, in fact, the Attica region of Greece witnessed the second deadliest wildfire of the 21st century. There were 99 confirmed casualties. Over 4,000 residents were adversely affected, and untold, undiscovered archaeological sites impacted throughout the region. This is, of course, not an isolated incident. In fact, 2 months ago in my new hometown in Seattle, the air quality was the worst out of any city in the world, as smoke and ash blew in from the massive fires burning acre upon acre of woodland from California to Montana to British Columbia. Now, despite the dispersed nature of these threats and the global nature of ecosystem loss and species extinction in general, so-called global climate change has in fact very local causes, impacts, and I believe solutions. And while these pressures will undoubtedly have profound and long-lasting impacts on cultural heritage, none are more problematic than, as Cristina Sabbioni of the Institute of Atmospheric Sciences and Climate in Italy states, the great importance of water as a threat to heritage. This threat can be obvious when it comes to intense rain and storm surges and floods. However, it can also be more subtle, as water may deliver pollutants to building surfaces, and increased humidity affects the growth of microorganisms on stone and wood, and the deposition of salts on various surfaces. Now, if we turn to the Republic of Mali, we can in fact already see such impacts in the form of shifting precipitation regimes and intense rain made manifest on the region's archaeological sites. As many of us in this room already know, throughout much of Africa, the temporal and geographic distribution of rainfall is regulated by the north-south migration of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or the ITCZ, as pictured here. Not very well, unfortunately. During the winter months of the Northern Hemisphere, this rainfall band is situated over the southernmost portions of West Africa. And as winter turns to summer, it moves northern, bringing the much-needed rains to Senegal, Burkina Faso, and northern Mali. While the monsoons have generally been relegated to the summer, in the past rainfall has been pretty well distributed over these months. However, this is beginning to change, and due to climate change, rainfall is now beginning to fall pretty much all at once and in very, very high amounts. These torrents have washed away homes, roads, and of course, archaeological sites. You'll notice with my focus on archaeological sites, I'm an archaeologist. Perhaps the most famous site in Mali, that of Geni Geno, is particularly vulnerable to such intense rainfall. Dating to 250 BC to 1400 AD, Geni Geno represents one of the earliest urban complexes in sub-Saharan Africa. Here you can see the site. This island here is in the center of this massive inundated floodplain of the IND, or Inland Niger Delta. And when the floods reach their full levels, Geni Geno and the other sites in the region essentially become tiny islands in the large lagoonal system. However, as the water recedes, it takes with it the edges of the site itself, along with pottery, stone tools, and human remains. To see this erosion in action, we can take a look at a digitized map of the site created by the first archaeologists to work at the site, Rod and Susan McIntosh, back in 1981. I went back in 2010 with a team to remap the site, and we can see the damage caused by the increased rainfall and subsequent river floods. You can see where the river had, oh, no, that's the wrong button. you can see where the river has essentially just eaten away the sides, and it's actually kind of flattened out the surface of the mound as well. Here's some other photos. Here are some of the large trenches that have been dug by the rainfall into the side of the site. And as you can see, they are quite large, some of them holding water even through the dry season. Now, every year these channels get bigger and the erosion worsens, and history is literally washed away. Now, due to the nature of the site, that being made of essentially melted mud brick, there's really only so much one can do to stem the destruction. However, in the early 2000s, the Cultural Ministry of Mali, in coordination with the Jenny Cultural Mission, embarked on a program of installing these retaining walls to stem the tide of erosion, I guess if you'll pardon the pun there. As you can see. Unfortunately, this is just a stopgap measure, and there is really a need for a more comprehensive study of the issue and a concerted conservation effort. These retaining walls will really only do so much. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like any conservation work will be resumed at Jenny or anywhere in Mali in the foreseeable future, because in addition to being underwater, the region is also under fire. Now, in a region so dependent on the rhythms of the annual monsoons, such dramatic change in timing and intensity can be deeply felt, disrupting subsistence and economic activities, mobility patterns, and simply everyday life. The flare-up in tensions between armed groups of the Fulani and the Dogon along the Banjagara escarpment in central Mali is almost certainly a recent, but yet far from the final manifestation of these disruptions. Historically speaking, Fulani pastoralists and Dogon agriculturalists have lived in a pretty tense equilibrium where land and water resources have been shared and use has been determined by seasonality. However, as this regional seasonality has begun to change due to man-made climate change, and water resources and land suitable for agriculture and cattle grazing have become scarce, this tense equilibrium has begun to break down. Thankfully, very recently, actually in June of this year, the Dogon signed a ceasefire agreement. But unfortunately, just as the ceasefire agreement was taking hold, the ongoing struggle against militant Islamist groups in Mali has worsened. I'm sure we are all broadly familiar with the situation in Mali, where in 2012, Islamist militants began a long-term insurgency in the north of the country. As loose affiliates of al-Qaeda, groups such as Ansar Dine began to establish their caliphate throughout the largely Sufi communities, destroying anything that did not conform to their views of Sharia law. The destruction ranged from soccer balls and cassette tapes to the famous Timbuktu manuscripts and Sufi mausoleums. While the origins of the insurgency and subsequent cultural destruction are multifarious, I believe that it is quite clear that climate change has at least played a role. As we've seen in countless other contexts around the world, militant groups such as Ansar Dine, but really any militant group of any stripe, are most attractive to populations of unemployed youth, farmers who have lost their crops, and pastoralists who have lost their herds. Unfortunately, as the effects of climate change continue to worsen, we will almost certainly be seeing these populations grow. While the mausoleums, such as Alpha Moya Mausoleum, have been rebuilt and the majority of manuscripts have been recovered, the underlying causes of their destructions remain and will likely worsen as climate change worsens. Now, I didn't set out to have such a pessimistic talk, and in fact I had a slightly different ending planned until yesterday afternoon when I was rereading a chapter by James Fairhead and Melissa Leach in this book. I encourage everybody to read it in this room. If you're curious about it, I will let you know the title. And I disassembled my argument for fixing the problem and pretty much my optimism with it. Hopefully that is temporary, and I'm really hoping to get some ideas and get some conversation going as we move forward in the next day and a half. And unfortunately, I must leave you there. Thank you.
I'm honored to be here. Good afternoon, colleagues. I don't have to repeat my name. He has said it, and the way you pronounced it, as if you are my clanmate. I'm going to talk about the need to enhance the role of community museums in preserving diverse cultural and natural heritage. And when I was listening to the speakers since morning, I felt a little bit out of place, because many of the speakers, many of the papers are coming from universities. They are university researchers. They have been presenting their research papers, objectives, goals, and so on and so on. And I was like, hey, do I belong here? But I think my paper was selected for a reason, because I come from this civil society where we need to do a lot of advocacy. As you heard, there are lots of problems in the cultural heritage sector, which problems cannot be solved from with one approach. The academia has to play its part, but the civil society has to play its part as well. So that's where I come from. Mr. Chair, how much time do I need? Do I have?
10 minutes, 15 minutes. Okay,
great. So this is the outline of my presentation. I'm going to briefly talk about community museums in Uganda, their role in preserving natural and cultural heritage, and then I'll briefly talk about the need or how we should enhance the role of community museums in preserving our natural and cultural heritage resources. And I'll stick to the time, 10 minutes. If we talk about community museums, what do we mean? These are local initiatives by Ugandans, family members, communities, local chiefdoms, kingdoms, as a result of the desire to preserve and promote their individual community cultural heritage resources. And the movement of community museum in Uganda started in 2008. By the way, I'm glad to mention that there is a Ugandan who doesn't look like me in this room, by the names of Kara. She's been in Uganda for some time, and what I'm talking about here is not news to her. And I'm very sure in her presentation later on, you'll be surprised to hear the way she's talking about Uganda and the cultural heritage resources. Back to business. The museums were supported to form and register an association in 2011, and this association is called Uganda Community Museums Association. They are at different levels of development, because some are rural, some are in urban areas, some are located along tourist routes, and those that are located along tourist routes are a bit much, developed and operational on a daily basis, whereas some museums that are a bit far away from the main tourist routes, they are, I would say, are struggling with a number of challenges, but at least they do exist. And to me, the existence of community museums in Uganda is a clear manifestation of the desire to try and decolonize the notion of a museum. Because many of us know how the movement of museums started in Africa. I don't want to say that they were started by colonial masters, but that is the reality. And there are reasons why they started these museums. Many of them, they were started because they wanted to understand who we are, what we do, what kind of food we eat, what kind of things we treasure so much in terms of our identities, so that they have full knowledge about us, and then they will be able to manage us in the proper way. So that is that could be. I stand to be challenged by the professors here, but to me that was the reason why museums were started in the 20th century. But today, the emergence of museums, community museums, is a sign, is a signal that there is a different version of museums, and this is how we want to be represented. This is how we want to present our cultures. But also, some of them are starting to make money, because there is this belief that you start a museum, definitely tourists will come. And when tourists come, they will give you some dollars. For some museums, it has worked. For some museums, it hasn't worked. Because if you want to get tourists, you have to do your homework well. You put the necessary facilities in place, the necessary tourist facilities, which some museums have not been able to do. But what is important in Uganda, and for me particularly as somebody who has been behind the movement of community museum, is that they are now recognized by the National Museums and Monuments Policy, which was passed in 2015. Because in the past it was really a challenge to talk about community museums and ask the government to come to the support of community museums, because the argument was that in as much as we might be willing to support community museums or give them support, there is no policy to guide the engagement of government with community museums. So we worked with the Department of Museums, and I'm glad to say that somehow, somewhere, community museums are recognized, and their role as supplementing the National Museum is very well documented, because some of them are located about 600 kilometers away from Kampala, and for some communities who are very far away from Kampala, if they want to access the museum, it becomes a serious challenge, because there is only one National Museum. So the community museums have come in to fill that gap. Then in terms of preserving and promoting our diverse cultures, it is very clear that community museums are helping to safeguard the cultural roots for now, but also for the coming generations. They are helping us to promote the important values of tolerance, respect for cultural identity, and cultural diversity, because many of them are, in many cases, are not focusing on one aspect of culture. There are several of them that present different narratives, different cultures, and sometimes I come from central Uganda, but when I travel to western Uganda and I find aspects of my culture being preserved in western Uganda, I feel very, very good, and I congratulate those people for having recognized that Uganda belongs to all of us, despite our diverse cultures. And then many of them have tried to promote peace and intercultural dialogue, again by preserving and showcasing the different traditional ways of managing conflicts, resolving conflicts, and allowing different people to come together and resolve their differences. And you'll find many of those kind of museums in the western Uganda and northern Uganda, where we've had a number of conflicts over a long period of time. But also, most importantly, most community museums, and I like this, because they guarantee access, enjoyment, and expression of cultural rights, because I'm an advocate of cultural rights, and the organization I work for, we have a program that is looking at cultural rights, because all of us have a right. As we had this morning, it is very important that we access and express who we are, we express our identities. But then the museums have come in because previously it was difficult to access the National Museum because of distances. But now they are spread across the country. So wherever you are in Uganda, you will be able to access your culture, or at least certain aspects of your cultures. You'll be able to identify the important aspects of your culture and interact with your culture. And then about 20 of them are supporting the Heritage Education Program, which we are running in about 140 heritage clubs, again across the country. These are clubs that are in secondary schools, and they are linked to community museums, so that when young people are asking for spaces where they can go and access their cultures, it is very easy to say, go to a community museum. You'll be able to access your culture. Because for them it is very important that they visualize what you talk about as young people. In terms of sustainable conservation of wildlife, or what we call natural heritage in this space, community museums, some of them, not all, some of them advocate for the preservation of clan totems. I don't know how it is here, but back in Uganda, we are clustered around our clans. And as a clan, you need to have a clan symbol or a totem. And in some cases, our clan symbols are animals. In some cases, they are trees. In some cases, they are, types of food. In some cases, they are birds. So you'll find that some museums have listed a number of totems, and they are keeping them. And some of them, by the way, they are endangered species. They are about to go. But then the museums are playing a very important role to publicize these important aspects of our culture. And if you go to a museum and you find that you belong to a monkey, yesterday I was sharing with somebody about the monkey clan. But if you go to a museum and you find that there is a monkey being preserved and your name is Mugerwa, automatically you know you belong to the monkey. So you feel it is your responsibility to ensure that nothing happens to the monkey. Or if your totem is an elephant, if you hear somebody trying to kill an elephant, you can't even shed tears, because it is like taking away part of your life. The elephant is your totem, and you feel it should be protected. And then some museums are close to national parks, and in being close to national parks, they support the diversification of tourism products. One might wonder how that comes in. How that come in terms of safeguarding our natural resources. But if you realize that. If our national parks are overcrowded and there are no alternatives, at one point we shall lose them. But if we, for instance, in the case of Uganda, I think many of us have heard about the mountain gorillas. The thing in Uganda, all the tourists that come to Uganda want to go to Bwindi National Park to visit the mountain gorillas. But the gorillas are also getting tired. So sometimes you go to the forest and you spend the whole day, you come back without seeing the mountain gorillas, and your money will not be refunded. So to avoid a situation like that, there are some museums that are close to Bwindi, and they can offer an alternative. So the stress is, becomes less on the national park because there is an alternative for the tourists. Because if you can't find a gorilla and then you go and visit the battoir, you visit the communities and dance with them, eat with them, and carry out certain activities with them, and at the end of the day, you will be happy, and the park will have been relieved of the stress. Then some of the museums showcase cultural practices that are in tandem with wildlife conservation. And this is the case of the Batwa Culture Experience Museum. I will show you some photos in a few seconds. And this museum is located near the Bwindi National Park, where we have the mountain gorillas. So it has done quite well in terms of taking away the stress from the mountain gorillas. And then some museums specialize in promoting the use of traditional medicine. And I think research has it that many of us, about 60% of Ugandans still depend or use traditional medicine. So if you know that in national parks, there are medicine, there are traditional medicine that you want to use and you want them to be there, and even for the coming generation to find them. So you'll be very careful the way you are going to use this traditional medicine. And some of the museums are really doing a great job in trying to promote the medicine. And then through some of the museums, communities are connected to the natural heritage or wildlife parks. In the past, it used to be a very big problem. Animals that died, people decide. People were always looked at as a problem to national parks. But that situation is changing. And actually in Uganda it was, like you train rangers, you give them guns, you spot a human being in the national park, you just shoot. And then, as we had this morning, people started retaliating. Poaching came in. I mean, how do you prioritize animals over human beings? So it became a problem. But with the emergence of community museums, the situation is a little bit changing. The museums act as a link. So if there is any support from the park, it comes through the museums, and then the community, because the communities are attached to the museums, because some of them actually donate items or objects to the museums, they feel they are connected to the park in one way or another, and they don't see any point in poaching or killing animals. So I'm not saying the problem is no longer there, but the magnitude is coming down. And it could also be because of other factors. I'm here to blow the trumpet of museums because that is what I know. And I know what they have done in terms of this problem. So these are some of the images of the community museums that are close to national parks. This is a museum by a small community in northeastern Uganda, extreme north, close to Turkana region. It is called the Ike House of Memory, and it is next to Kidepo Valley National Park for some of us who have a fair knowledge of Uganda. So this is the Batwa Culture Experience that I was talking about. It is run and managed by the Batwa community themselves, which some of us like calling Pygmies, and personally I don't like that name. They are Batwa, that is their name. Pygmies is a description of who they are. And this is another museum that is located in western Uganda in the Rwenzori Mountains by a local community or a chiefdom of Dinjia Wabamba cultural institution. And this museum used to belong to Obusinga bwa Rwenzori. My colleague Kara is going to talk a little bit more about it. But on a sad note, it was destroyed in 2016 when we had a lot of political conflicts in 2016. But we pray that they will be able to reconstruct it. But as we talk now, it is not there. And I think this is my last slide. So what do we need to do to enhance the community museum's role to preserve our culture and natural heritage? One, I'm proposing that we need to build the capacity of museum managers in wildlife conservation, because there are specialities in museum, but it is very important that they should know how to conserve wildlife, so that as they conserve cultural heritage, they also take into account the connection between cultural heritage and natural heritage. And I'm also proposing that we should formalize the collaboration between community museums and the managers of wildlife parks, or the managers of natural heritage resources. Because at the moment it is something that, I can choose to do, I can choose not to do. But if for instance, we sign agreements or memorandum of understanding, it will be incumbent on the museums to understand that they need to contribute to the preservation of natural heritage, but also it will be incumbent on the side of the managers of natural heritage resources to work with the community museums for the sustainable management of our natural heritage resources. Then it can also work if we come up with common tourist products. For instance, if tourists are going to the national park, and then we agree that, for whoever goes to Bwindi, for instance, it is a must. They should go to the communities around. I think that will make a lot of sense. And then it is very important to engage young people, because as we talk now, many of our young people are quite disconnected from the issues of heritage and wildlife management. So it is important to engage young people, and for the case of Uganda, 75% are young people below the age of 30. So it's a very big group that we are missing if there are no deliberate efforts to engage them. And then it is also important to support community museums to document knowledge, skills, and values that encourage natural heritage preservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here in Pretoria, finally, because when we started this whole serious culture in crisis with the V&A 3 years ago, we said we want to hear to your voices from Africa, and we heard our voices in London, and we heard our voices in New Haven, and it's really for me wonderful to be finally in Africa, so thank you very much. What is hidden behind that a little bit cryptic title, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly, you will soon find out. Well, so now is the way, yes. So cultural heritage, as we've heard over the day, is the essential record of human existence and of human identities. It is the thread of continuity for which people search when the rhythm of their everyday life has been shattered. And that's exactly the same whether we talk about the Museum Island in Berlin. Can we get the lights a little bit down, because my slides are not so good, that you can be a little bit more visible. The same on the Museum Island in Berlin, or in the North Dakota Access Pipeline Camp in Standing Rock, North Dakota. There is a strong allegiance to World Heritage which connects people across all cultural and political boundaries. No matter where we come from, no matter what we studied, we immediately tend to understand the significance of our cultural and natural heritage. Just arrive a little bit too late in the morning to Lake Louise in the World Heritage Site of the Canadian Rocky Mountains Park. You'll have a hard time to take a decent picture of Lake Louise and the surrounding mountains, because tourist buses have arrived and everybody wants to get this picture. Cultural heritage also is bridging cultures and bridging generations, and I'm happy to refer to an example from a small Jewish cemetery in the outskirts of a village in North Bavaria, where we're documenting together with school children from Israel the cemetery, but where we also have the incredible privilege to actually get a Holocaust survivor from that very village living now in Long Island. An elderly woman, Lottie, has to come to our class and talk to our students. And that's so valuable if you can actually listen to the voice of those people. Why does it matter? Why heritage matters to them? And what should we do to preserve it? Well, cultural heritage is by no means only a positive resource. It is very often contested, and a very good and recent example are the Confederate monuments across the United States. Which, after you probably heard, after 2015, the roof shooting in Charleston, have provoked a wave of different reactions across the country. So some of these monuments are gone, like the Robert E. Lee statue in Baltimore, they're not anymore there. Others, like on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, they're still standing, right? And in, again, other cases, they're there, but they're disguised, like in Birmingham, Alabama, with a black fence. So we are struggling with our heritage, and not only in the US, we're struggling all over the world. The late David Löwenthal explains why and what he perceives as the difference between history and heritage. So he says heritage clarifies pasts so as to infuse them with present purposes, and that's quite a distinct difference in his famous book, The Heritage Crusade and the Spoils of History. Obviously, we're also struggling because we have for way too long clung to just one side of the story. Last week when I was speaking in Berlin, I spoke on October 8th. There was the Indigenous People Day in the United States, which we're commemorating that day. Let's take a brief look at the Lewis and Clark Memorial in Cutbank, Montana. The Lewis and Clark expedition is an iconic date in the American history after the Louisiana Purchase. Is this expedition going west and mapping out the new territories, right? Overseeing here the railway, actually, the East-West Railway. But you can't see that, unfortunately, on the slide, but it's a graffiti on it says, Pokulni Blackfeet Land, which means, you erected that monument of the Lewis and Clark Memorial actually on Native American country. Just one brief example. In our Western conservation ethics, reduction of use to avoid wear and tear is a basic principle of conservation. So we put our objects in display cases, we limit the light, we just don't want them to be exposed to any kind of use. Well, for the native communities, however, use often equals preserving culture. Actually, preserving culture means using it. So I think I would like to say what sharing heritage really means. And this word goes across, especially in the global north now, you can just always hear that everybody wants to share heritage, right? The whole year was called Shared Heritage Year in the European Union. So what sharing heritage really means is to bring this debate together, deal with opposing and, like in this case, even mutually excluding views and seek compromises. And let's be honest, the concept of conservation arriving with Western colonizers is also wrong. Just one example, we have that of course all over the world, in Angkor Wat, but in many sites. But in Timbuktu, for example, there is ample evidence for repair maintenance over centuries. So that is not a new concept. Cultural heritage is increasingly threatened with destruction, not only by physical and chemical causes of decay, but also by changing social and economic conditions, and we heard a lot about this morning. Natural and man-made disasters are a very important factor, as we see by the cultural war crimes committed in the Middle East and in Africa. And it is not a renewable commodity, and actually all those people who go to the museums and admire the objects, I talked about this to Vijay a few days ago. Also go to the caves and look how the caves in Simsim in Xinjiang province in China look after the Germans took those 700 square meters of mural paintings to Berlin. Look like that. Catastrophes like the fire in the National Museum Rio de Janeiro on September 2nd can happen anywhere and any time. I always repeat that. We had, after the fire, we had a reaction saying, well, in Brazil, there was no funding and we should help them, and especially from the northern countries, right? I mean, in Germany, definitely one, United States. Well, I don't know about any museum, any large museum who really has an efficient emergency preparedness plan for their objects. They may have for the people, of course they do, but a state-of-the-art plan for how to deal with a fire, a flood, a terrorist attack, I don't know any, and I just speak for the museums I have been working on. We also have, of course, the two devastating earthquakes in April and May 2015 that hit Nepal, took almost 9,000 lives, and destroyed a large number of cultural heritage buildings. But this is our personal attention. Among the real reasons why do we lose cultural heritage, these are minor factors. The accelerating global transformation from a rural into an urban society has massive implications on cultural heritage. More than half of the world's population already lives in urban areas. Every week, the urban population on Earth grows by 1.3 million people every week. The 50 largest cities would rank on position 3, right after China and the US on the emission table on greenhouse gases. So, you know, we have to be aware of this as a I mean, this is a view of our Yale Center in Beijing. Yeah, every year you can make a different picture on that. Tourism, the international tourism sector is both a source of prosperity and degradation and decay. While it may advance development, many heritage sites are obviously struggling with its negative impact on so many levels. We know that tourism ranks 4th behind fuels, chemicals and food, like 6% of global exports, higher than cars, you know, and imagine what that takes for a German to say, right? Higher than cars. But 9% of global GDP are actually linked to tourism. And if you go to Machu Picchu today and you really hope for a selfie with you and maybe you and the Lama, you have no chance. There's no possible. Global climate change, as we heard today, brings rising seawater levels, increasing floods and severe weather events. Of course it does. Like here in the Alaskan village of Shishmaref, an island permanently inhabited for 4,000 years. But rising seawater levels, by the way, just in Germany, we read last week in the Spiegel that 3 million people are directly affected by rising seawater levels, just in one country. Global climate change, as we heard, has also secondary implications, which are related to access to culture, access to science, and so on. When a World Heritage Site is destroyed and lost anywhere in the world, we are all diminished. Even if it's from another region, another period, another culture, another religion. The disappearance of a culture, writes Holy Father Francis in this encyclical letter Laudato Si, the disappearance of a culture can be just as serious or even more serious than the disappearance of a species of plant or animal. And I think that's why we're here, to talk to each other about nature and culture. Any loss of cultural heritage is a loss of our common memory, impairing our ability to learn, to build experience, and to apply the lessons of the past to the present and to the future. And with this, the destruction of cultural heritage is inseparable from the persecution of people, and therefore I think a humanitarian imperative. Looting and illicit traffic also is not a new phenomenon. The Arch of Titus in Rome shows, you know, how Roman soldiers carry away the spoils of the Second Temple from Jerusalem, including the famous menorah. It's a little bit dark here, but there's like 8 soldiers carrying that loot through Rome. That is not new. I ask and I encourage my students whenever, you know, when thinking about crisis, I think we should try to look with the other eye. And I encourage my students, when they go to a museum, and they should go as often as possible, ask yourself, where do all these objects come from? Ask the question, where do they come from? Don't even think you have to give advice where they should be, but learn and ask where they come from. Ask also, why does this sculpture, for example, have no feet? Why so many sculptures from Asia have no feet? Can it be because of the way in which it has been removed from its original location? Iconoclasm, also not new at all, right? I mean, it's not an invention by Daesh. Famous drawing from the French Revolution by Goya, he doesn't know what he's doing. And then the iconic films from ISIS or Daesh. Always it's the ladder, it's going up to the artwork, it's the respect, and yeah. Well, I believe first and foremost, we need to be generous and creative in our support to those who defend cultural heritage in the first line on the ground. In Africa, but also in Syria, in many countries. Those local and state conservation professionals deserve our respect and our support, because there's nobody but them to save cultural heritage. No Yale, no Oxford, it's just those, you know, boards of antiquities, right? Those, and maybe the community museums. I want to talk very briefly about reconstruction, because my time is running out quickly. And so in a world where material culture is fragile and at risk, reconstruction can be a tool for cultural preservation. Like the Lion of Alat, you know, restored by a Polish team in 2005, destroyed by Daesh in 2015, then brought to the National Museum, and then just last year actually restored with the assistance of the Polish team again. We should, but however, when we talk about reconstruction, it's worth mentioning that there are places of memory, such as the route, for example, following the march from Selma to Montgomery, led by Dr. Martin Luther King, where physically there's little to be preserved. There's almost nothing there. I mean, the Pattis Bridge, right? Pattis Bridge. But because of the events that took place there, the pathway of the march has transcended into national heritage. The fourth industrial revolution, brings us an experience of increasing collaborative efforts in collecting data, setting standards, advancing digital technology. I mean, that's obvious. It will require new forms of technology, and I know many of you are involved, addressing issues of obsolescence, of legacy technologies and migration, and of course also new methods for formal education and heritage and for public engagement. I very much liked when Fredrick spoke about the young people who are disconnected from cultural heritage. That's another thing which is exactly the same in the global north. That is not a specific thing of the south, and I think we should be aware of that. When we learn something about heritage, we actually increase its value. Knowledge is a contribution to the sum of these values, and I'm really deeply convinced that this knowledge needs to be shared among all the stakeholders. There should be transparency. These documents shouldn't be hidden in drawers as we experience that in so many museums around the globe. Simply posting, a picture online doesn't mean sharing heritage. I mean, when do we finally understand it? An estimated 7.6 billion people, more than half of them have no access to the internet. This offline population actually also is disproportionately illiterate. It's female, it's elderly, it's less educated, lower income, and more rural. How long want these people keep outside of the doors? Putting a picture online, like so many museums say, well, we share it, it's online. I don't think that is a solution. And there's another important lesson. We note a shift from the assumption that cultural heritage is static to a more dynamic picture, when the very essence relies on the inevitability of constant change. Where once we try to prevent change, we now find ourselves actually managing change. And the challenge is how to do so sustainably. So with this, the preservation of cultural heritage arguably is one of the grand challenges of our contemporary world, similar to other grand challenges like world health or environmental sustainability. Ban Ki-moon described, when he came to Yale in 2016, cultural heritage as essential to the United Nations mission of peace and security. Well, one question I have is, how can people be convinced that, notwithstanding their cultural, religious differences, how can they be convinced that their interests may actually overlap? And who is actually us? I think that's something we can always talk about. And universities like Yale have a critical role in preserving and sharing knowledge, instilling respect for cultural heritage and diversity. We need the energy and we need the idealism of the young people to develop this field and discipline. And with this, I want to resolve the question of the title. Well, Dr. Martin Luther King writes in his August 1963, in his famous letter from the jail in Birmingham, Alabama, what sounds like a perfect way to sum up what cultural heritage means for our societies in current times of change. He writes, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in the single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." In the roadmap for sustainable conservation of the 21st century, I think conservation is no longer just about objects or sites. It has to be about the people who are affected, connected with this heritage, who hold some degree of ownership, wish to explore, to use, or to preserve it. And I think that's what the future brings, and that's what UNESCO actually also tries to do with the social media campaign Unite for Heritage. Thank you very much.
To study here at the University of Pretoria, and it's so good to be back after a couple of years being away. I'm an archaeologist, and so I sort of shifted or manipulated my topic, right? Because I'm coming to the University of Pretoria, and I really didn't want to talk about Mapungubwe, because I thought there'll be so many people coming to talk about Mapungubwe, and I was like, wait, I'm going to have 10 people. By the end of the session, everyone will be like, we've heard everything about Mapungubwe and how important it is. So I thought I'll shift this talk to something I've started doing quite recent, which is integrating the tangible and intangible heritage and the Changa ruins in Great Zimbabwe. So, Great Zimbabwe is one of those famous sites that everyone knows about, I guess, but I'm going to just give you just a brief information about it. It's located in Zimbabwe, in the province of Masvingo. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It is a site are a culture, to say the least, that comes after the Mapungubwe time period, right? So when Mapungubwe collapses, the idea is that Great Zimbabwe rises on the other side of the Shasha-Limpopo confluence area. And these sides of the Great Zimbabwe are made up of stone walls, as you can see, very beautiful, and they sort of start on the northeastern part of Botswana and then start moving into the Zimbabwean interior and up to Mozambique. So it was sort of like an early empire, if you want to think about it. But again, for archaeologists, using words like empires and state becomes problematic. And so I started working on this project in the summer, which is South African winter, sorry. I started working in Zimbabwe this winter on this particular project, particularly looking at these Changa ruins, which are like these sites called the satellite sites. So they're not attached to the main great enclosure or the main site, which is what you see up there, but these are separated. They might be 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers away, but they are within the Great Zimbabwe premises or cultural landscape. And so I am working with two main people. I work with Prof. Innocent Pikarai, who's the head of the department in the anthropology and archaeology department, and the other director is Dr. Sulis. She's an associate professor at Aarhus in Denmark, at a university in Denmark. And so they brought me in the project to come have fun, because I'm an archaeologist and I like being dirty and digging. But it's sort of like one of those projects that really ask important questions that we need to know in archaeology. The rise and fall of states in Southern Africa. Although I'm not going to talk much about the archaeology, I'm going to talk about what the tangible and intangible heritage that they are looking at, and how we can really start looking at community engagement from a different eye. Instead of looking at it as a financial benefit for the community, but looking at it as an educational, with more imbued meaning to people, where people can really take care of this for later preservation so that these sites can last longer. And so the project has a landscape approach. It's quite interesting because I feel like it's one of the few archaeological projects that do this. And I also feel like as heritage specialists, whether you're in a museum or you are at a university having a faculty position, it is very important when you look at heritage, you sort of understand that the intangible and tangible heritage are intertwined. So is the natural and the cultural heritage. And we need to be sort of really careful in terms of how we really understand this, but also really understand it from a broader perspective of just not engaging the community to make them stakeholders to benefit financially, but make them benefit emotionally, because remember, heritage is imbued with meaning. So people need to be proud of their heritage. And so this research project sort of like gives you like a glimpse or a lens of what's going on. It's still new stuff they're doing, and it started a couple of years ago, I think 3 or 2 years ago, but now it's like picking up and they're doing more archaeology. And so they have this landscape approach where they see the landscape being part of the cultural or having cultural heritage. This includes the archaeological ruins and the material that's going to be excavated, the oral history of the community, and the social memory. So in Great Zimbabwe, you have local communities living within the premises of the heritage site. How cool is that? You rarely see people living within, because sites are supposed to be protected from people, but within the Great Zimbabwe, you have the local communities living there. And then they're looking at the natural heritage and the natural landscape, looking at waterways, how these waterways change, how they have different names according to Shona names, right? And how this changes and gives meaning to the landscape. So sort of like understand what's going on, both as an archaeologist, but also as someone who's trying to build a heritage conscious community in the landscape. So during our time there, we sort of did some surveying and mapping around the landscape, as archaeologists do. And you have a mixture of different types of heritage showing the history of this landscape. So you have you can't see it clearly, but you have the Bushman rock art right there, the rock art, the painting. It's quite faded because of the sun and the rain, but you can clearly see the pigment on it. And you can see that how long this landscape has been occupied. And then on the other side, sorry, the lighting is not good. On the other side, you have ceramics like potsherds, right? And so it's so difficult because they're already on the surface. It's so difficult to date them, to try and figure out what time period can they date. But luckily, unlike West Africa, where Pete works, in Southern Africa, we've sort of created a chronological markers for style to understand the time period of the chronology of ceramics. And so you can see some of these ceramics are early, some of them are way later, like 19th, 20th century, or even modern glass bottles. So this landscape is being used in a very interesting way, and this is just away from the main Great Zimbabwe enclosure, the hill complex and the Great Enclosure. At the same time, within the landscape, you have the intangible cultural heritage, and this is part of the tourism industry that the heritage site has, or the monument has. So you have a cultural village where you have Shona women and men dancing to tourists, and they get money for that. And I unfortunately like to dance, so I joined them in. But it's sort of like you can see the passion of how they sing about like songs that some of them I could understand because I speak a bit of Shona, but some I couldn't understand the words. But you get lost in this interpretation of what Great Zimbabwe is all about and people having meaning to what's this. And then we looked at the natural heritage. And so the natural heritage was sort of like mixed between the social memory and cultural heritage within the natural landscape. So you have these rivers or these streams going around Great Zimbabwe landscape, and they all have different names. And these different names mostly are in Shona. And so the idea is to try and get to a point where you can really, because they mostly translated, so meaning has been lost, but going back to the local community to try and re-translate them to understand the landscape and what it means to people. Sorry. And the other aspect that we looked at, which was really interesting for me, is that we look at the different plants in the area. And it's so interesting that people could identify to me, who doesn't live there, obviously, was like, don't eat that plant when it's raw. It's good if you have a stomach bug, but it's bad when you don't have one. And they could pick up which trees are indigenous and say the indigenous name for these trees and the Shona names for these trees and the different social memories and the powerful meanings. So sort of like this is a medicinal plant, whilst this one is just a fruit tree. And so it's sort of like makes you understand the landscape that this society was living in during the Great Zimbabwe period and how the communities living there right now sort of understand what's going on. And so my question was, but how do we integrate these ideas, or these archaeological evidence and social memories, and to preserve the tangible and intangible heritage? And I feel like it's through community engagement. And I have said before, community engagement to me does not mean financial gain. It becomes very emotionally problematic to me when we need stakeholders. They can run the hotels, they can be tour guides. That's very important, but we need to create a community that is very proud of their heritage, especially in Africa. And so it's to sort of like to have an active preservation and have multiple voices. And so we are working with the Great Zimbabwe University, and one of the chiefs, actually Chief Mugabe, who actually is the chief of the entire area or region where Great Zimbabwe is a student at Great Zimbabwe University and is studying archaeology, but he's also a history teacher. And so he's trying to sort of like encourage not only to the people that he's chief to, not only to be like, we want to work in the monument and gain money, but to be able to understand what's going on within the academic, but also to understand what these sites look like and what we can talk about them. The other thing is, within the Great Zimbabwe landscape, there is like a primary school, which is quite significant because I feel like in Setswana we say, you bend a child when they're still young. So you bend, like with like clay, you can mold it while it's still fresh. And I feel like if we can start installing these ideas and going an extra mile for sort of like for making people aware of these heritage sites and making them really encouraged to be part of this, not just for financial gain, but just to be able to preserve this site would go a fair way. The other thing is that we need to sort of start acknowledging the indigenous knowledge system and how people really understand these sites and what they mean to them. For us to sort of like come with frameworks and models within different sites, I'm not saying this would work for all sites in archaeology in Southern Africa, but we need to sort of like, especially when you have a local community, to start really thinking about what it means to be a local community and what it means for us as academics, as researchers, going in there and trying to get all the information we can without giving back. So we need to really be transparent and share all this information to be able to create a generation, especially at a young period in their time, to be able to know how to preserve site, what not to do, don't move rocks, and things like that. The other thing that we are doing, or the project is doing, is training and including the local community. And so we have the tour guides. We had a meeting with them and they attended some of our lectures that we had like once a week because we were there for a long time period. And we had like the other local chiefs coming in and we spoke about how we can share information, because for them it's like, it's always an issue when we have tourists coming in and they know more about what's going on more than us, and we need to really start changing that. We need to train, we need to be able to, when an article comes out with new material, it needs to get out to the tourist guide. It cannot just remain in the academic realm. That becomes an issue if we want to preserve heritage and we want to talk about preservation of heritage. With that being said, so this is the team that we worked in with. There's a couple of the UP students, but mostly was the Great Zimbabwe University student. And they were really encouraged and very excited about this project, because it did not just mean that we get to excavate and leave, but it meant a longer, process of relationship between us and them, and how they can learn from us and how we can learn from them, and how this is an exchange of heritage between two different people, between people that could actually really save God and preserve heritage sites, maybe not just in Zimbabwe, but across, the globe. All right, I think I'm on time. Thank you to attend.
Thank you. I have a request. In the sense that I have a longer version and a shorter version. I'm going to start with the longer version. So in case I overshoot, Stefan, you always know, just cut me short. Yes. To just give you a little bit of perspective, but before I start, normally my talks I kind of dedicated to the unknown craftsmen, because we are all here because of them. And especially in India, they never signed their works. You would never see a sculptor who has signed his works. So I bow down to the wisdom of the ancients. The bronze that you see there is 1,200 years old, and you can see the smile still there. And to the kings and patrons who promoted these craftsmen, and to people like you who are helping us preserve them, thank you. Yes, I called what you see of bronze, which is a very modern way of looking at it as art. How do we, as Indians, as people, see these objects? We see them not as objects of art. Literally, in my home language, we call them tirumeni, which translates to body of God. These bronzes were ceremoniously woken up, bathed, they would be dried, they would be clothed, they would be fed, they'd go through important functions, and in the night, the Lord and his consort would be put to sleep in their own bedroom inside the temple by singing songs as well. So that's how we look at these objects. So they were not created as objects of art. They were living gods, and they continue to be living gods for us. Sadly, the Western world looks at them as pieces of art, and starting with the US, rich people started buying them, coveting them as objects of art. And this one I picked from Stefan. I know it's not very clear. This is a very famous restitution case from the Norton Simon Museum. And there you have Norton Simon on record saying, hell, I know it's smuggled, so what? And this was in the 1970s. And the same bronze, when he came back to India, and that was the ceremony which we had. But then, has opinions changed? This was an art show last year in New York, where our gods and people are posing, and to me it's defilement. And these are not objects of art that have to be traded as showpiece curios. So what's happening? Because of this demand, we people are being robbed, and sadly, because of the lack of knowledge, we don't know that one of them is a fake. So the idol on the left is actually a modern replica, whereas the main two ones are the original 1,000-year-old ones. And I have numerous such examples. So the man here is one of the Lords Rama, the consort is a modern fake. Where are all the originals? Sold, publicly auctioned, adorning catalogs for millions of dollars. And what does this do? It's akin to wildlife. This bronze, it was in India, it was with a dancer, it was taken from a temple. All her identity was erased. She was put up for sale for this kind of money. It's almost $1 million. US. This kind of money can get you anything in India. And I'm not talking about singular cases. There are tons of these artifacts, and this one in fact was up for sale for almost $3 million. And I just modified my presentation for you, Stefan. You want to know where it was from? That's the looted site of the Jaina Anch. It's in Mount Abu, and you can see the modern replica being encased in cement, crudely put inside. And I'm not speculating here. I know the smuggler who offered this for sale. This is the robber offering photo. This was what he mentioned on the back of that photo when he offered it for sale. 11th century Mount Abu. And this is how the market operates, converting sacred objects. And these guys are not random looters. These auction houses paid their staff to come to India, sit with these smugglers for months together, go on recce trips, pick and choose the best of Indian art for loot. And it was looting on an industrial scale. So what we have locks. Do you think they can save $1 million? No way. Our gods are being robbed, and it's happening to this day. So that's why I started the India Pride project. We work on many aspects: restitution, awareness, being a deterrent, policy. Of course, our laws are toothless, but at least we do have some few laws. And again, we work with international law enforcement and Indian customs for capacity building. Why? Before I started, this was a headline in the year 1985. And I can go back to 1960s, I can go back to 1990s, 2000. Every decade, we seem to have these big headlines, thousands of idols being stolen. There are token photo ops. The embassy would sit down, have a big get-together. Nobody would get arrested. To give you in perspective, the main auditing body of the government, the CAG, put out a report in 2013. Between 1972 and 2000, India recovered 19 objects in all. Between 2000 and 2012, 0. We recovered 0 artifacts. So what do? We leverage social media. We raise awareness, we take people on heritage trips, go to schools, school kids. This is a friend's initiative in a small town where on WhatsApp, they just pick and choose a site to go every first Saturday of the month, and everybody comes with his own transport, and they invited me to one such session, and we had over 300 guys turn up. And incidentally, this is a site that dates back to 3rd century BC, which has got inscriptions that you can actually touch and read the script that I speak today. So the history has a written history of 2,300 years. And these people saw it for the first time, and there was the team that went there. I'm sure next time they find a looter, they're not going to let him loot anything. So I think engaging the public is very, very important. And then we went further. We use social media to create an archive. Over the last 10 years, I've used Facebook to create the largest distributed archive of Indian distributed objects worldwide. So you name a museum, you name a collector, name an auction house, I have the pictures. And then we invested with friends and volunteers. We bought every book published on Indian art, scanned it. We have volunteers, scholars all over the world who are collecting catalogs, purchasing catalogs, scanning it for us. Anything published on Indian art, we are putting up into our own database. People are reporting finds, because earlier they would go unreported and robbers would steal them. Today we have a Twitter handle called Bring Our Gods Home, and people report thefts live. How does this help? We are building the knowledge base. As part of the UN Convention 1972, the country need to have an archive. India didn't. We want to provide it. We want to build something and hopefully hand it over to the government. We're data mining the archive. So this is an image from a book in 1918, which was showed an idol when inside a temple. Today it's in Singapore. The only evidence was this book, published in 1918. So I will touch more on the need for archiving and use of photographs. On publishing photographs, theft photographs, I always have an argument with scholars. To me, if it's a fresh theft, I would say publish the photograph. This is a classic example. This was a temple in central India. Robbers had they took away this idol. So the trustees of the temple wrote to me and said, what do I do? I said, when did that happen? It happened last night. I said, do you have good photographs? They said, yes. I said, just put it out in every vernacular press. So the next day morning, every paper had photographs of this idol. And you wouldn't believe it, the next day, the robbers threw the idol in a nearby forest and went off because they knew it was unsellable in the international market. Because the international market is well informed and they have better scholars than us advising them, sadly. So, yes, the ruse that our guys use, this is a published photograph when this idol was still on site. They made a replica. So, what you see on the left is a replica, the right side is the original, and this was crudely stolen and they left the replica there. And we believe that this was the original for 4 years, by which time the idol was taken off to London. Peter Watson published his book, Sotheby's The Inside Story, and in that he had one chapter on India. And based on that, we arrested Vaman Gia, the largest idol smuggler at that time. In 2002, he apparently confessed to selling 10,000 items of Indian art via Sotheby's with a host of 5 Swiss companies, front ends, used to send it to Switzerland. This dealer who bought it in London got cold feet seeing his arrest, and in 2003 gave it to the Indian embassy. But the embassy didn't know what to do with it. They just kept it there, and it's still there in the Indian embassy in London. When Vaman Gia was being acquitted by a court in 2013 for want of evidence because India did not even bring back one of whatever 10,000 he's accused of being stolen, when the evidence is right there. So what did Vaman Gia do? So this is, in case you have not read it, I'm sure you would have read it. Just give you one example. This was a 15-ton boar form of Vishnu, one of our gods. The robbers yanked a chain around its leg, used a truck to pull it, breaking the legs off. Why the legs are not there, Stefan? And it's currently in Zurich. So when the Indian government reached out to the collector said, I have 3, which one is yours? So we do not have a proper archival photo, so we've not been able to secure it for the last 16 years. That goes where we need to look at archives. Thankfully, the French Institute in Pondicherry embarked on a massive digital archival exercise in 1950s onwards. And till recently, they had these bin cards. So I used to go there, sit there, you would get thousands of these small cards, and then you need to pick for matches, and you give them, and they would go develop it and bring back from the original slides. And it's been invaluable. So this idol is from a village very near my hometown. It's a beautiful concept where Shiva, who is one of our primary gods, gives half of his body to his wife. So he's an androgyne. Half of it is male, half of it is female. And this statue is 1,050 years old only. And it had 2 hands broken. And I had researched it for my blog site. I'm not an academic, by the way. I have a day job. So I looked at it from an iconographical perspective, because when you match a male and a female side, the body tends to move to other side because the male generally is shown taller. And to balance it, the sculptor brought in the bull to balance, so you can see him leaning on the side. Now, I didn't know when I blogged about it in 2008 that robbers had taken this photo, after crudely removing from the site, sent it off to the US. From there it landed up in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and they bought it for close to $1 million. So when I got this photograph from my good friend Jason Fells, I went to social media again, tapped my volunteer network. I said, anybody in Vrindachalam? Within an hour we had a guy on site, and there was this fake sitting there. And we reached out. It was a published photograph, and it was still in situ. So we went to the UN convention. It's very good when both the countries are signatories. Australia had 30 days to refute. They had no refute. Their Prime Minister brought it and gave it back to the Indian Prime Minister. And there you see him or her on the right side. So this is where the importance of having archival photographs work. So I'm going to rush to a similar case. This was a Nataraja which was sold for $5.6 million. And again, this is the priest who's praying to an empty shrine. He was actually initially picked up by the cops. They thought he was complicit in the crime, and he was kept inside bars. You know how it is in India. When you go behind bars for a week, you carry scars for the rest of your life. And this guy, even after that, used to go to the temple and offer prayers to the empty shrine. Robber photo, obviously, it had a provenance that it had reached America miraculously 6 months before the UN convention, as every other artifact seems to have. Everything is left India between 1969 and 70. In Subhash Kapoor's catalogue, on display at the National Gallery of Australia, bought in 2006. And then the curator, as usual, said there are hundreds of Natarajas. You can't differentiate one from the other. So we sent one of our volunteers, we took a high-resolution photograph, went to the French Institute of Pondicherry, managed to find the photograph, we made a comparison, and so instead of giving it to Ron Radford, we put it on YouTube. So it's available even today if you go. It's called Return of the Dancer. We matched. And these bronzes are very special because they're made by the lost wax method. Each of them is individually handmade. The mold has to be broken to remove, to show the original. And we had 33 places where there were minor damages, cracks, and individual marks. No way that they could do it. It was as well returned. We took it to the temple. The villagers received it, kept it in the same spot from it was stolen. And this was how the villagers, it was a ruined temple, yes, but this was how the villagers decked up the temple to receive its Lord. These were the shipping documents, incidentally. I am in the shipping industry. It was shipped as brassware for $300 out of India. And it was an LCL shipment. It was not even a full container. And we have worse. We have got shipments coming out of India declared as garden furniture. So we had similar cases. I'm just going to run through these. This is from the Singapore Museum. Again, got returned. The Toledo Ganesha, again, we didn't even know that there was a museum in Toledo, Ohio. We went in. Subhash Kapoor had donated, he sold this object for $300,000. He donated $500,000 in cash. He donated 240 2nd century BC artifacts to the museum. I'm like, doesn't make business sense, right? You sell something for $300, then gift for $500, and then on top it up with some more gifts. Basically, this is how they ingrain into the community. They gain access into the collecting lobby. Fortunately for us, this Ganesha had a small blemish, and the French Institute photograph is so important and so good that we could actually match. But then I'll show you the photo later. The Toledo Museum, as usual, asked when we reached out to them, said, "Who the hell are you?" But they got scared. They wrote to the Indian Embassy. For 3 months, they didn't get a reply. They wrote to the Indian High Commission. For 6 months, they didn't get a reply. Finally, they gave it to US Homeland Security. And when our Prime Minister went to New York in June of 2016, this bronze also came back. And that's the small blemish that you see on the trunk. And that's how important archival photographs are. With this blemish, we could prove and bring back. We have hundreds of these cases. I'm just going to run through these. This was another case, a centrally protected site, which was on sale by German Novels in London. We managed to get it back. It was returned 2 years ago. Again, thanks to archival photograph. This is something that we're working on. This, incidentally, is a ceiling which is in the Denver Art Museum. We have given them the proof. That's how she looked before she was looted. These are the matching work that we do. The Denver Museum asked us, go show me a photo of the empty niche, and it's 30 feet high. So right now we've got somebody who's building a ramp to go up and take photographs. They feel this evidence is not enough. So we had such cases going on forever. We've got a lot of these bronzes. This bronze was returned by the Kimball Museum in New York in 1985. But then what's shocking is in London, when they raided the gallery who sold it to the Kimball Museum, which was Emerald Art Gallery, they found 240 idols, and in the home of Chabria, they found 41 idols. They seized it, and today, after it was in 1986 when they seized it, the case papers have gone missing. Nobody knows what happened to these 281 seized idols. The guy is not charged, and nobody knows what happened to these 200, including India and Scotland Yard, have no reference. And we have published papers which document this raid. Priests were flown from India. They identified the objects when they were seized. We didn't know what happened. So these are current live cases I'm going to show you. You're photographing it, videographing, go ahead. I don't worry. So this is last seen Christie's auction, March 2003. This is currently located in the Freer Sackler Museum. Christie's auction again. Current location, Cleveland, Ohio. So we're working on that. Hopefully next time I meet, I will show you with a minister holding these. They will go back. This is with the Asia Society in New York. Again, all these photographs were supplied to us through social media outreach. People wish to remain anonymous. They send us these images. They said, my grandfather told me that this photograph was missing. Go find out. And this particular photograph, they managed to find it from a photo studio that developed this photograph in the 1970s. So, yep. This idol, when it comes back, will be the most expensive restituted object. It's a $15 million yakshi, which was stolen from a farmer's home. Poor guy had documented it. It was a registered antiquity in 1978. Home-breaking theft in 2004. They stole this. It was in the market by Subhash Kapoor in 2006 for $15 million. It's currently seized. Hopefully, we'll come back end of this year. Main talk, 5 more minutes. So, people, my favorite hobby, you all look at Netflix, I look at art videos. So I was looking at the TEFAF videos when I had this gentleman speaking on camera, and the object that he has in his back is an artifact that was stolen from a centrally protected site in 2007. He's a dealer in London. He has refused to cooperate apparently. I don't know what it means. Here he is in his shop giving an interview with the object behind him. Either he sold it or he has kept it. He's still not told us what. But instantly he was speaking in French. I didn't know French. So I went to my group. We have a group of friends on WhatsApp. And I said, this guy in TEFAF is speaking in French. What is he talking about? And Linda, my good friend from Accra, she came back and said, forget it. It's just this dealer in London. But incidentally, she said, I'm going to TEFAF next month. I said, as usual, whenever you see an auction, you see an Indian object, you please send me. As luck could have it, In January of this year, a friend of mine who's currently the principal economic advisor to Prime Minister Modi was talking about my work to a friend, and the old man had come to him for some other favor, and he said, "Can Vijay solve this theft?" And it was a theft from 1961. In 1961, the Nalanda Museum was hit by 2 thefts. And Nalanda is, as you know, the most sacred Buddhist site. And these were excavated bronzes from the Nalanda Buddhist site. And a total of 16 bronzes were stolen. Sadly, there were no photographs available. And in fact, this was a paper presented by Italy and India in a UN conference in 1976 when they mentioned that one of the bronzes was with the LACMA. But the LACMA refused because they did not have any conclusive proof. So from 1976, India has been battling this. As luck could have it, my friend, my old man, retired officer, you know, in India, when you make a mistake, whether you have committed it or not, you get a black mark, and he had missed one promotion because of this theft. And he had kept all the paperwork with him for 57 years. So he supplied us these photographs from his files. And you know, in true filmy style, I put it up on my wall for one day before my wife throws it off. I commit them to memory. And he gave us the physical description, and we did find the original photo when it was still in the museum in LACMA. It's a perfect match. Indian government has started working with the LACMA. It should have ended there. But casual exchanges on WhatsApp. Linda tells me I'm going to TFF in March. I said, "Do you have a list of dealers?" I said, "Yes, I have a whole list." I gave her a list, and she said, "Can you mark which ones you want me to track?" And then I gave her a list. On the list, you have all the major dealers. As luck could have it, she said, "Hey, there's one more guy who's selling Himalayan art who's not on your list." I said, "No harm, just send me the photograph." So she sent me on WhatsApp, and mind the time difference, I was sitting in Singapore at 1 o'clock in the night, I'm getting these photographs, and there is this vague image. And I'm like, I know this guy. And you know, the robbers were so smart. They actually broke a leaf from the left and they've stuck it to the right to make it look like a different one. So this was the original image, and you can see the leaf on the right side, and they'd actually physically altered with the object to make it look different. But then, you know how Indian law enforcement is. It was a live auction, we had to stop it. So I called up Linda and said, "Linda, I have a match, but it'll take me some time to convince the Indian government because there is this slight difference." So we went to the Dutch police, and Martin, who's a good friend, a big guy, he's about 2 feet, but same width, he goes in and says, "This is stolen, you can't sell it here, take it off display," and just walks off. No notice, nothing. He said, "This is the max I can do, at least I won't get it sold here." So the dealer said, "No, but it's on consignment to me, I'm taking it back to London." I said, "Good." The Met Police were informed. So we made all the matches as usual. We gave them all, so there were critical marks in it. Finally, I got the ASI to move, thankfully, and they sent out a letter to the Met Police. But despite this, the buyers disputed, the owners disputed. They said, "We have 10 places where it doesn't match." So ICOM expert was invited, and ICOM expert concurred with our match. And in August 15th, in a ceremony, this small Buddha returned back. It was given back to India. So I'm going to end there. Thanks for your time, to say that there is hope. The youngsters are using social media for good purposes. Please photograph what you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here, and so unfortunately I'll be talking about the more depressing side of social media and antiquities trafficking. Vijay is using the crowdsourcing for good, and I'm going to show where unfortunately there's a negative aspect to that. And most of this research focuses on the Middle East and North Africa. So as archaeologists, cultural heritage experts, this is the type of landscape we're used to focusing on. But after the Arab Spring in 2011, we need to consider this landscape as well, and the way that the social issues actually affect the cultural heritage today. the Arab Spring, social media really took off in the Middle East. Smartphones became used much more frequently, and Facebook was king among social media in the Middle East. Of course, WhatsApp is used, but I think anybody who's on Facebook knows that there's not any social media site quite like it in terms of all the capabilities available. And if you look at the numbers from 2011, when the Arab Spring happened, to December 2017, you'll see there's been a massive increase in Facebook usage in the Middle East and North Africa. Some of the highest percentages of increase are all in countries that have conflict right now. So the conflict has actually not lessened people's access to social media. And as we know with terrorism in different areas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, social media is also used as a conduit for recruiting and propaganda. So it's no surprise that we're seeing these kind of rises. I mean, a 4,000% rise in Facebook users in Iraq is pretty incredible in that short period of time. So when we're looking at social media, there's the use of social media in the Middle East for freedom fighting. That's what made it famous during the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, there's a negative aspect to that as well, and that is where this comes in. And this is where we stumbled upon Facebook trafficking groups. So there are groups and pages on Facebook, and these have essentially become repositories for people from across the Middle East and North Africa to meet and trade artifacts. Try to find buyers, try to find sellers, and this is just one example of the types of things that are offered. This is a Christian manuscript that's being offered. Sometimes it's through video, sometimes it's through photo. Usually an image or a video like this is just a sample, a kind of bait to show the dealers you're the real deal, and you can continue communicating through private messenger after that. So these are the kinds of groups that we're looking at. And one of the reasons I pointed out this particular group is because where we can take advantage of Facebook's API is where if you're a group member and you have your location listed, Facebook will tell you the other people in your location. So this is an Arabic language group that traffics artifacts, and you'll see it has a massive membership, 160,000. It was only 155,000 last week when I looked. It gained 5,000 members in a week. And this also shows all of the individuals that are based in Washington, D.C., just Washington, D.C. And we can look at New York, but there are people all over the world because in a globalized world, people speak many languages, people immigrate to different places, so it really has advanced the way we see transnational networks. And Facebook is speeding up that process. But that was just one example of these groups. Currently, Amr and I are tracking 40 different groups that are trafficking artifacts on Facebook specifically, just Arabic language groups, and 39 pages. The groups are different because they're closed, so you actually have to request access from an admin. That's why the trafficking is more likely to take place in the groups, because there's a certain level of protection. You have to sometimes answer questions, and really the questions could be nothing. It could just say, you know, why are you here? So I'll just write in Arabic, I like archaeology, and they let you in. This is another group. So we have one with 73,000 members, one with 85,000 members. Sometimes there will be people who are members of multiple groups. Sometimes there are admins or moderators that are administrating multiple groups. There's a set of about 9 or 10 individuals running across the Middle East and North Africa that are the moderators of 5 different groups, the largest groups that we are following right now. But it's not just the average Joe who's finding artifacts in his backyard. You also have terrorist groups that are engaging on these sites. We all know that ISIS traffics antiquities, and while it may not be their primary source of financing, it is the only source of financing that can be laundered onto the Western market. Black market oil is not going to make its way to New York, but artifacts can. And so we don't just see ISIS engaging, we see Hamas and now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib. We're seeing this is a new evolution of the way terrorist groups are using financing. It's one of the only things they can use that can make its way here, that can make its way to the US, Australia, and you'll see later how some of that can happen. So all of the images that you see here were items that were offered on these trafficking pages. Some of them, like this sarcophagus, there's actually several photos where they were showing the process of looting this. And you'll see the building around it, it looks like the mortar is wet. That's because they'll construct a building so that they can mask the fact that they're looting. Because the cost the penalty for looting and trafficking in Egypt is life in prison. On the far right is a Syrian mosaic that has been removed from its original site. This is typically how they are trafficked. You find them rolled up, and then they'll be much easier to transfer onto a shipping container and move somewhere like New York. In fact, just about 2 months ago, there was a Syrian mosaic seized in Los Angeles that was looted since the revolution. My words aren't looking great here, but these are just a couple other examples that have appeared on trafficking pages within the past 3 weeks. This one on the left right here, I took that video 2 nights ago that was offered on Facebook. These are legitimate artifacts, and it may seem kind of crazy. You know, how is a sarcophagus going to make its way to the United States? It happens. Operation Mummy's Curse, actually a $1 million Egyptian sarcophagus in pristine condition, was trafficked to New York. It was found in a dealer's garage in Brooklyn with artifacts from about 7 other countries. And what's important about these type of artifacts is that something that large takes a very sophisticated network to get it out of the country. Egypt is pretty aggressive in trying to stop looting within their means, and they're one of the more aggressive countries, not just on the repatriation issue, but on trying to stop artifacts leaving the country. So to be able to move something like a sarcophagus without being detected, you have a very sophisticated network and likely a lot of connections. So Facebook's really become the ground zero for how these guys meet. It's democratized the looting process. Whereas before the revolution, people were, financed through tourism. We see the economic aspect of that. But after the Arab Spring, Western tourists were not going to Egypt. They weren't going to Jordan. They weren't going to countries that didn't even have an Arab Spring. But there was this general fear that because that the Middle East is one big country and that they're all in turmoil and that you shouldn't go. So as a result, the tourism revenue in countries like Egypt, where it was 13% of the GDP, absolutely plummeted. And that leaves a lot of people financially desperate. So you'll have Ahmed digging in his backyard, and he finds some coins or he finds a statue, but he doesn't have a network to sell that. He doesn't have anybody that he can gain value from. How is he going to find a trafficker? He doesn't necessarily want to get involved with mafia or a gang, so he goes on Facebook. And this is a case study of just one page that we recorded from the time it was established in November 2013. It is actually the only page that was pulled down of all the pages that we were monitoring. It was pulled down in March 2018. And during that time, we recorded 2,000 individual profiles actually interacting on the page for the purpose of buying or selling antiquities. Of those, 123 of them are women. This is commonly thought of as a man's game, but the women in this instance, they were not the looters. These women are higher level traffickers. These are middlemen. Whereas Vijay is looking at the source market and where things are making their way to the Western market, we're looking at how stuff is getting out of that region. We're looking at the middleman's middleman here. And so it's hard to see on this graph. The country on the far right are people who did not list in their public profiles on Facebook the country that they are based in. This large one here is Egypt. Now, that does not necessarily mean Egypt has more trafficking than other countries, but population-wise, Egypt has a lot more people than all of the other Arab countries. So statistically, there are going to be a lot more Egyptians on these pages just by way of population alone. So this is an example of some of the women, and 3 of the women that were middlemen were based in the United States. And one of them, it appears, actually went to grad school at GW the same time as me. She was offering to connect with high-level buyers in Saudi Arabia and was specifically looking for Quranic artifacts at the time. So how do we know this stuff is looted? A lot of collectors' lobby will say, this item could easily be from a private collection, from a family. You can't prove that it's looted, right? Well, some of these we can. The day after Heritage Protection Initiative recorded this video of an item being trafficked out of ISIS territory in Syria in 2015. It's a very unique artifact. This isn't something that was going to be molded. It's carved, and each of the faces is unique. And there are special markings, as you'll see when it turns, that there's a dark side here on the right side of the face. As we were going through the page listed in the case study, we found that exact same artifact available on Facebook in 2017. The artifact was in a different context. We know it had moved. It had not moved out of the region yet. So it gives us somewhat of a timeline of how this material, how long it takes for some of these materials to get out of conflict zones. So this is one example of something we know for a fact was looted from ISIS territory, because we have activists on the ground who are risking their lives to get these kind of videos and create an archive for items that may not have necessarily had one. As Vijay said, an archive is incredibly important, and when you're dealing with looting from tombs, looting from the ground in the Middle East, those archives don't exist because nobody knew that material was there to begin with. So using information like what's being recorded in Syria right now and comparing it to what we're finding on Facebook, these guys are actually inadvertently creating an archive of stuff that's being offered. If they're listing the artifact and they're based in Jordan, or they're based in Egypt or Tunisia, none of these countries have a legal trade in antiquities. So just by their national laws alone, what they're doing is illegal. So there are several stages of communication. Basically, with this kind of Facebook usage, the trafficking, the smuggling process is streamlined, it's sped up. Whereas before, if you're an Egyptian smuggler and you want to get something to Turkey, you might have to meet a Jordanian friend who's somewhere down the line in person is going to have to introduce you to a Turkish friend, and you're going to have to figure out how to move that material. But now you can just search those people on Facebook, or you can join one of these groups and actually find people on Facebook who are looking for specific artifacts. So step one, you initiate the contact through social media. You have Jewish artifacts that you want to get to Israel, but it's Moroccan Jewish artifacts. How are you going to get them there? Well, you post them available online. So what we see here listed as a Jewish artifact. And then you initiate the conversation. You bait somebody, you show them you have material, you give your WhatsApp phone number. You say, hey, contact me on WhatsApp. This is when we have difficulty tracking it. This is because the communication is almost always moved to encrypted messaging. WhatsApp is the most popular, just because it's commonly used throughout the Middle East, but Facebook now has an encryption option on their messenger, so private messaging on Facebook is another way that they'll communicate. In addition to that, there's also Telegram, although this is a little bit less secure. But these guys are pretty open. I mean, they should publicly share all their information, and you can go to most of their profiles and see their families, see how their kids are growing up. These are not fake profiles. These are people who put all of their information out there publicly. And one of the challenges is, though we may see the items be moving to encrypted messaging, since Facebook is the ground zero for how these guys are meeting, if we can cut off that issue, we've stopped that streamlined process of the smuggling, and we're slowing down the way these guys are connecting. And of course, the last step is the item goes offline and it is no longer available. The actual transfer of goods happens in person, and usually cash transactions. So one of the things Vijay discussed with India is that people would go and actually kind of loot to order. They'd pick what they wanted from temples and have that looted. We have loot to order here digitally. On the left, you see the admin of the trafficking page that has since been pulled down, although they just create a new one after that. And he is specifically requesting Jewish artifacts to be available in Amman. Why is that? Well, the largest market for Jewish artifacts is Israel. Israel does have a legal trade in antiquities, and there are several loopholes in their law that make it easy to launder materials onto the market. So Jewish artifacts from Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, all of these countries make their way across North Africa, through the Sinai, and into Israel. So as you see here, somebody's replying with photos to prove they have a large Jewish manuscript that they can offer. On the right, the admin is requesting for Islamic manuscripts and books to be available in Istanbul. And as you see, somebody's giving a description of things they have available, giving you an image to show that they can produce the goods, and giving the WhatsApp number so you can move to encrypted messaging and he can show you the better stuff. But trafficking is not the only way that these groups are used. Because so many people are financially desperate, a lot more people are getting into the game of looting. And if you stick a shovel in the ground somewhere in the Middle East, you're likely going to turn up artifacts. So a lot of these groups are also being used to crowdsource knowledge on how to loot material. Here, again, these are all images shared on WhatsApp or on Facebook. And on the far right, you'll see those are just two examples of infographics that are created as kind of giving people who have no knowledge of looting the architecture of tombs in different areas. People from different countries. In Egypt, they'll share very detailed descriptions of Egyptian Roman tombs, what period, how far you have to dig before you start to hit cultural material, what the dirt's going to look like when you get close to the material. And if you have any questions, just share your photos of what you're doing, and they'll give you guidance along the way. On the left here, another issue with looting in Egypt, again, just population-wise, this is where most of it's happening, is groundwater will get into underground tombs. So this is one of the rigs that they're showing as an example. They make it look like a well, and they create makeshift pumps to pump the water out. Sometimes the water is too deep, so they'll make suggestions on how you can create makeshift scuba equipment to actually dive down and get the materials out of the tomb. And this is something that is really growing in popularity just because so many people are trying to find ways to loot. And it's not just descriptions of how to loot, but also ways to use magic and appease the jinns, because in Jewish tombs, the jinns protect the artifacts. So you need to have a sheikh, and you need to buy this special stuff from me because I'm the one that's going to make sure that you aren't going to get any bad luck after you because of the jinns. Those guys are just swindlers, and the trafficking pages are where you really see the legitimate guys moving. Oftentimes, they will take pages down if they think somebody's a swindler. They like to offer something called red mercury. Doesn't exist, but they'll take thermometers and say, oh look, this is red mercury, because they misunderstand what mercury in a thermometer really is, and they will try to sell it to people as a way to help them open tombs. In the higher level trafficking pages, those types of swindle offers are taken down, and they will put up disclaimers. We're only dealing with legitimate stuff. So you have to give us a video with the newspaper from that day to prove that it's your video, that it's recent, and that those artifacts are available. So this is just one aspect, and actually this is just the Arabic language pages that we're currently following, but we have also started following pages in Indonesian, where there is trafficking of both artifacts and wildlife, and also Turkish language pages, which are highly popular. There's a page with about 175,000 members where they trade artifacts and also information on metal detectors and updates on legal issues in different countries, so that people know how to get around what the new policies are when countries try to improve their cultural heritage protection efforts. So this is really the new generation of what is happening with transnational trafficking in the Middle East and North Africa. And it is not, although these pages are Arabic language, I wasn't able to put a slide together for this, but just to give you an example, of the 40 pages, there are 285 different individuals who are admins and moderators collectively of these pages. You can have up to 20 people as admins and moderators of a particular page. These moderators are from places like Cairo, Damascus, Amman, Istanbul, Tunis. Not surprising, right? These moderators are also from New York, Berlin, Los Angeles, Toronto, Paris, and more. So these are the people that are high-level traffickers, and they are part of much larger transnational networks that you can follow when you map them out, have a perfect line of typical trafficking networks across the Middle East and North Africa. So working to try to get Facebook to change their policies and make, as of right now, cultural heritage and cultural property trafficking is not banned by Facebook's community standards. Just as of this past April, when Mark Zuckerberg went before Congress, did they decide to ban wildlife trafficking. Until then, that was not explicitly mentioned in their community standards. Activists went after them, and they were able to change those. And without any violation of community standards, there's no mechanism for reporting what's happening on there. So there's technically nothing these guys are doing wrong based on what Facebook is allowing. And getting Facebook to change those policies and share this kind of information with law enforcement in the local areas, or at the very least with the FBI for the individuals operating within the United States, could have a huge impact on the speed with which this material is moving out of the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you very much.